Okay, thank you so much for coming. This is joint work with Maris Angelitas and Christian Wolf, who is here. So business cycles have fiscal consequences, so may necessitate fiscal adjustment. For example, if you have any sort of automatic stabilizer like income tax, if you have a recession and you're going to have a budgetary shortfall, so this may necessitate fiscal adjustments. And because of this, two natural questions emerge. First is how does the pace of the fiscal adjustment shape the response of the macroeconomy to shocks? And second is what type of fiscal framework best supports the central bank? So in the textbook representative agent model, so the answer is fairly simple. You would like sufficient fiscal adjustment to avoid fiscal dominance. But beyond that, because of the Ricardian households, because Ricardian equivalence holds, the exact timing or the exact speed of the fiscal adjustment will not matter for the equilibrium dynamics. Today, what we're going to study is in Hank type of environment. So of course, the speed of the fiscal adjustment matters. And we're going to show first that slow fiscal adjustment is stabilizing the economy in a strong sense. And this supports the central bank. So in particular, in the analytical environment, we will build on the overlapping generation New Keynesian model we used in our earlier work as an analytical proxy for non-Ricardian behavior in Hank type of environment, together with automatic stabilizer, which we're going to just model as an income tax. And so our first result is positive. We show that slow fiscal adjustment act as a dynamic automatic stabilizer in response to macro shocks. So let's consider a recessionary shock that, because of the static automatic stabilizer, cause a budgetary shortfall. And then we show that slow fiscal adjustments can have two effects. One is its output stabilizer. So because you have a budgetary shortfall and you need to hike tax, and with non-Ricardian households, if you put you delay the tax, you delay the fiscal adjustment, you push the tax adjustment further into the future, this is going to stimulate aggregate demand and this is going to stabilize the output. So what is surprising is that this output stabilizing is very strong in two senses. One is going to stabilize the output is going to increase with delays in fiscal adjustment in all horizons, both in terms of the impulse horizons and also in terms of news horizons. And second, it's going to limit to perfect stabilization in the net present value of output. So a recessionary shock initially going to have, of course, a recession. But if you further delay the fiscal adjustment, this could create a boom in the future, and this leads to a perfect stabilization in terms of present value. And the second thing is the tax reduction. By stabilizing the output, this also stabilizes the tax revenue through the automatic stabilizer. So this can endogenously reduce the amount of tax hike needed, so tax reduction. And then we're going to ask the question, does slow fiscal adjustment support or hurt the central bank? As you will see, the theory is informative but ambiguous. So we're going to identify some conditions that sometimes the slow fiscal adjustment is attractive. And this is the case if the cycle is mostly demand-driven or tax hikes are sufficiently distortionary, but this can go the other way around. So this motivates a quantitative analysis. So we first basically summarize the appeal of slow fiscal adjustment by two sufficient statistics, leveraging Chris and his co-authors' earlier work. And we show that for the context of US business cycles, it does seem to be the case that the central bank may prefer slow fiscal adjustments. So here is the environment. So on the aggregate demand block, we built on the overlapping generation New Keynesian model that we used in our earlier work. So we use omega to capture a survival rate. So if omega is smaller than 1, this is like overlapping generation model. If omega is equal to 1, this is just the standard representative agent New Keynesian model. So what does omega smaller than 1 does? It achieves like two things. One is it increases MPC. So because with the possibility of death, this is going to increase MPC. The second thing is going to discount future output and going to future income and future tax. So this is going to break the Ricardian equivalence with some probability of death in the future. The future tax don't affect current demand one-to-one. So this breaks the Ricardian equivalence. So that's the kind of the standard overlapping generation model how it breaks the Ricardian equivalence. And on the aggregate on the aggregate supply block, so we consider just a simple myopic static Phillips curve just for analytical simplicity. And in the quantitative analysis, we're going to show you with a standard forward-looking or hybrid Phillips curve, all the results going to hold. So there are going to be two shocks in the model. Sure.
Yeah, that's a modeling question. So here, one way to have somewhat myopic consumers is this perpetual youth. But on calibration grounds, it's, people still have a life expectancy of, I don't know, 30 years old.
Yeah.
So they're a little more myopic, but not that much more myopic. So is it that in the calibration, suddenly you will make them much shorter lived, or how do you?
So in the calibration, we're just gonna basically match the IMPC matrix. So because I think the objective here is to capture Hank type of behavior in a somewhat
Yeah. It will be as if they have very short lives, which they don't in practice, but that's
so in fact, quantitatively, because we want to match the entire IMPC matrix, so we're going to introduce multiple types of this type of perpetual use consumer. So you're going to have different types with different omega. So you're going to have one type that has a fairly high omega that's pretty patient, and then there is one type with very low omega because you have some hand to mouth type of agents. So that's how we do it quantitatively. So this is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And then on the fiscal block, so in the analytical analysis, we're gonna just consider one period non-contingent real bond with a flow budget in which DT captures the real value of the public debt and TT is the government's revenue. And of course, there's gonna be an interest return. So again, quantitatively, we're gonna extend this. We're gonna have long-term nominal bonds calibrated to the maturity of US Treasuries. In terms of tax revenue, so it has three terms. The first term is this fiscal adjustment term that's standard in the monetary fiscal interaction literature. So it captures the idea if the real value of the public debt outstanding is high, you would like to raise tax to increase the revenue. And the tau d going to capture the speed of this fiscal adjustment. So if tau d is equal to 1, this is fast fiscal adjustment. So basically, when the debt go up, you immediately raise tax. So this is fast fiscal adjustment. While the tau d is equal to 0 is basically the complete fiscal inaction. So basically, the smaller tau d is, you're going to have a slower fiscal adjustment. And the higher tau d is, you're going to have a faster fiscal adjustment. So right now it's lump sum. And later on, we're going to talk about distortionary case. And tau y is basically the strength of the standard static automatic stabilizer that from income tax rate. So this is basically the static automatic stabilizer. And later on, we're going to show basically the delay of fiscal adjustment acts a dynamic fiscal automatic stabilizer that amplifies the static automatic stabilizer. And the final term is just offsets the budgetary impact of interest through lump sum tax. So this is for analytical tractability. We relax this quantitatively, and we didn't find this term matter that much quantitatively. So that's why we in analytical analysis we just do this to achieve tractability.
Okay.
Sure.
You go back to the previous.
Sure.
To what extent the result depend on Hank as opposed to depending only on a wedge between the discount factor of households and rates?
So the key thing is you break the Ricardian equivalence on the household side. So for example, if we have Xavier's model, I think with cognitive discounting, I think the baseline results also will hold.
There are multiple ways of breaking it. One of which is precisely generating a wedge. The rates discounting households and the government.
Yeah, I think that the results will be somewhat similar in that case. So then we turn to kind of the monetary policy of the central bank's loss function. So this is kind of an extended version of the standard dual mandate central bank. So the first two terms capture basically the standard dual mandate objective. So here we have like efficient steady state. So basically YT both is the deviation from the steady state, also the deviation from the efficient level of output. So you have the standard square Y and square pi terms. And the third term is basically captures the empirical reality that the central bank is unwilling or unable to move interest rates abruptly. So here it takes the form of square root of the real interest rates. And this basically, for example, the standard justification in the literature is the interest rate gradualism due to transmission uncertainty, like Brainard's argument, or the effective lower bound of financial stability. So the essence of this is basically the central bank has some, frictions in practice. They cannot move interest rates all the time. So in fact, every FOMC meeting, they move 25 or 50 basis points. And this prevents them to kind of frictionlessly achieve the dual mandate outcome. And then we can ask whether the fiscal framework supports or hurts the central bank, because the fiscal part will also matter for the stabilization of aggregate demand. So in terms of equilibrium, so we have the standard definition for the bounded equilibrium. So given the two shocks, which is cost push shock and demand shock, and also the interest rate path, so we just consider bounded equilibrium paths, such as household and firm optimize, and the fiscal block holds. And then we also study the optimal monetary policy equilibrium, in which basically the central bank choose the interest rates under commitment as a function of the shocks and to basically to minimize the central bank's loss. And so we ask two questions. So the first question is a positive one, which is how does the slow fiscal adjustment, a lower tau d, gonna shape the macro responses to shocks? And the second question is that does the slow adjustment supports or hurts the central bank, which is basically how the speed of fiscal adjustments together with central bank choosing the interest rates optimally, how this will affect the central bank's loss function. So we'll start with the positive part. So this part will follow the recent literature in kind of fiscal multipliers. So we want to isolate the impact from the fiscal effect. So we take the real interest rates as given. So we're going to study how the fiscal adjustment speed impacts the shock with impulse response given the path of the real interest rates. So in kind of the hand-ish environment, we study with positive death rate, so omega is smaller than 1, and with the existence of the automatic stabilizer, so tau y is positive, they're going to exist a unique bounded equilibrium in which you can write down the equilibrium output path as impulse response to the demand shock. So in particular here, the demand shock is either the exogenous demand shock Vs, which is a contractionary discount rate demand shock, or can come from interest rate hike. So both Vs, which is the exogenous demand shock, or interest rate hike, the Rs is basically a contractionary demand wedge. And here the fancy YTS captures the impulse response of output at period T with respect to a date 0 news about this demand wedge at period S. So that's what this YTS is. So it's basically impulse response function. So it's basically the output impulse response to a demand recessionary demand wedge. So our first result is a uniform stabilization. So for all the impulse and news horizon, so this output impulse response actually increases with the delay in fiscal adjustment. So if you push the tax hike further into the future, and because of the non-recurring households, this is going to stabilize aggregate demand, and this is going to stabilize, and in this case, because of the recessionary shock, increase output. So in a sense, like this stabilization itself is not surprising, but what surprises, at least to us, is that this is actually so strong that it actually stabilized output for all the horizons. So this is a horizon by horizon result for all the impulse and news horizon. And the second result is the limit results in terms of the perfect net present value stabilization. So for all the news horizon, the net present value of the output gonna converge to 0 if the fiscal adjustment is further delayed. So it's basically you're gonna have a recession at the beginning, but you're gonna have a boom in the later, and then the net present value of the output is perfectly stabilizes. So together, this basically show the slow fiscal adjustment or the fiscal adjustment speed endogenously amplify the standard static automatic stabilizer. So in this sense, the fiscal adjustment delays acts as the dynamic automatic stabilizer. So we're going to illustrate this result or explain the intuition of the results through a visual representation. So we'll start with the case with fast fiscal adjustment. So in which case here the tau d is equal to 1. So we have fast fiscal adjustments. And in this case, you have a recessionary demand shock. So this is the AR1 recessionary demand shock. And you're going to have a recession at the beginning. This is going to cause a budgetary shortfall because of the automatic stabilizer, the income tax revenue goes down. And this means with fast fiscal adjustment, they're going to raise tax. So that's why you see the second panel that the tax is increasing. But with the increase in tax and with the non-recurring households, sure. Close a little thing.
You can drag it out of the way.
Yeah. Okay, good. And so here is basically you have a recession, you have budgetary of a shortfall, so you need to raise tax. And with non-recurring households, when the tax is increased, this further depress aggregate demand. That's why the output decrease is large here. And this generates a fairly large recession. So now we delay the fiscal adjustments. So when we delay the fiscal adjustment, first just by partial equilibrium with non-recurring households with positive death rate, when you push the tax into the future, this is going to stabilize the output. So output is going up. And this also have a second general equilibrium effect that if you look at the fiscal adjustment, the tax hike pass, so we have two lines. If we look at the dashed line, you push the fiscal adjustment into the future, you just delay it. But now when you delay it, because output stabilizes and because of the automatic stabilizer, the tax revenue also stabilizes. And this means basically you're going to have more tax revenue because output is going up. And then you endogenously need to hike less tax. So that's why the general equilibrium black path is below the partial equilibrium dashed path because you're going to get more tax revenue from the automatic stabilizers. And so you don't need to hike tax as much as before. And this further stabilizes aggregate demand because you kind of hike like less tax. And so that's why when you further delay the fiscal adjustment, you can see the output path is going up. And if you further delay it, you can see the entire impulse response of output is going up. This is related to the strong stabilization results. And this is horizon by horizon, the entire output impulse response is moving up. And then if you push the fiscal adjustment speed to be very slow, and what you can observe in the output path is that you initially have a recession, so it's a negative shock, but eventually you're going to have a boom, so the output is positive, overshoots at some points. The reason is basically if you delay the fiscal adjustment, and because you have a recession at the beginning, so you're going to have a budgetary shortfall, so the public debt is going to become elevated. And if you further delay the fiscal adjustments, that just means at some points, the negative shock has passed, but the public debt is elevated and with non-recurring households, and that's why you're going to have a boom at some points. And this starts to point to the direction about the second results on the net present value. So if you have an initial recession and a boom eventually, so this you can see how the net present value of output converge to zero. But this still doesn't explain why the net present value of output converge exactly to zero if we further delay the fiscal adjustment. So the intuition is if the net present value of output is not zero yet, it's still some negative number, that means you still need to do some fiscal adjustment. You still need to hike some tax. But if you need to hike tax, and if you further delay those tax hikes, this can further stabilize the output because as long as you need to do some tax hike and you delay it with non-recurring households, the output and aggregate demand are going to further going up. And so basically this loop only stops until the net present value of output is perfectly stabilizes. And that's why we have this limit results. If you push like the fiscal adjustment further into the future and the net present value of output is perfectly stabilized.
Just,
Sure.
this may sound like thinking, but when you compute your net present value of output, you use beta to discount.
Yes. Yes.
As opposed to beta times something.
Yes.
Is there a fundamental reason for doing that, or why is that net present value particularly interesting, as opposed to say the net present value that an individual consumer would be interested in, which would include omega.
So because this is the one, so this is the one that matters for the government budget. So the government budget has this automatic stabilizer part, which is exactly tau y, which is income tax, times the net present value of the output. And because the discount come from the household side, and the government just the steady state interest rates is the standard one divided by beta. So that's why we discount the output based on beta. But that said, it's kind of if we could work on with the beta omega version, it's not going to be exactly converged to 0, but the comparative statistics is going to be exactly the same.
I may have missed something, some normalization, but so this limit result is there is a lower bound for tau b, which is like 1 minus beta, right?
So it's 0. So because here this is so this because there's kind of so I think this we're showing some of our earlier work in which is basically this Leaper region changes in this type of environment with kind of a hang type of households together with automatic stabilizers. So even if the tau d is 0 because of this, yeah, exactly, yeah. Yes, it's symmetric, so it's completely symmetric.
And the adjustment function going to now, or when there is an expansion, instead of pushing it away in the future, you push it away towards now. The limit results is.
So the limit result is always you push so here it's kind of if the tau d converges to 0, you're going to converge to the perfect stabilization. So in that case, it's going to be you have a boom at the beginning, but have a recession at the end.
Trying to introspect on the, I mean, I'm always happy when people tell me they delay taxes, but I'm trying to internalize the quantitative figure. So what is the static transfer multiplier? How big is it? So if you just in this economy send $100, what happens to GDP?
So here, in fact, the static multiplier doesn't really matter for those results. What matters is kind of you have the cumulative,
quantitative nature of the model. What would dy tau be?
So that's gonna depend on basically kind of the MPC. So that's gonna be governed by the MPC. So what gonna matter a little bit more for our purpose is basically the dynamic multiplier. So that's gonna be governed by y divided by the tau y, which is the income tax rate, which gonna be I think the gonna be around 3. 3, because we have the standard income tax rate, which is 1/3. So
So if I send people
$100, yes,
taking into account distortionary taxation, how much will output go up?
So the cumulative output or the present value of the output gonna go up by 3.
That's a big number.
Yeah, that's a big that's a big number. But in the quantitative, so this is the case with fixed real rates. So if we, for example, have a Taylor rule, and then if we have some sort of inflationary financing, I think we can bring down this number to around 1.2, 1.5, and starts to be close to the number in the literature.
Well, that's the question.
Yeah.
What do we think the number should be? As I said, I mean, we don't have to answer that now.
Yeah.
But that seems like an important background question.
Yeah. So one thing that's kind of interesting is kind of actually in this type of environment, if you at least have a fixed real rates, it's actually pretty difficult to escape this 1 divided by tau y thing. So it's kind of there are a lot of forces. So you could have very high MPC at the beginning, very low MPC at the beginning, but so you're gonna affect the timing of the transfer multiplier, but it won't matter that much for the cumulative transfer multiplier, at least within this class of models. So okay, so before this is purely positive, so now we turn to basically kind of normative part, which is basically does the central bank prefers slow fiscal adjustments or fast fiscal adjustments? So for this question, so we use the lens of envelope theorem. So we start with the central bank loss function evaluated as the optimal monetary policy equilibrium in which the central bank chooses the path of real rates optimally as a function of aggregate shocks. And then we use the envelope theorem. And so basically you can study basically the partial derivative of the central bank's loss function with respect to the speed of the fiscal adjustment. And you can connect this with the exact same object we studied in the positive part, which is how the speed of the fiscal adjustment affects the output impulse response. So you may wonder, where is the inflation impulse response? You just use the Phillips curve. And where is the interest rates? This is where envelope theorem comes in, because the interest rate is chosen optimally. So when you use envelope theorem, it disappears. So that's how you basically connect this part, which is, does the central bank prefer slow or fast fiscal adjustment with respect to the first part, which is how the speed of fiscal adjustment affects the impulse response of output. So basically we see that lower fiscal adjustment speed, the slower fiscal adjustment, increase the output, stabilize the output. Is this desirable? So let's first start with the environment of the demand shocks. And so in that case, we're going to have a recession. So the output is negative, inflation is negative. So if I have slow fiscal adjustment, what can happen is output going to be higher and inflation also going to be higher. But this is all seems to be good if you have if you have a deflation, if you have a recession, if you stabilize inflation, if you stabilize output. So this seems welcome. With a wrinkle though, so this is short run, as we see before, if the fiscal adjustment is very slow, you could overshoot. So it's a bit like a fiscal adjustment. So maybe you don't want to slow it down permanently because of the potential overshoot. But actually later on, we'll see this is not the case. And then we're going to turn to the case of supply shock. And in this case, actually, the intuition reverses. So in particular, we consider positive cost push shock. So inflation is positive. And what the central bank wants to do in this case is they want to engineer a recession. So they want to hike rates to engineer a recession to bring down the inflation. And in this case, the fiscal adjustment is basically undoes the central bank. Slow fiscal adjustment is going to stabilize output, but the central bank is actually want to engineer recession. So the slow fiscal adjustment actually undoes the central bank's efforts to fight against inflation. So in this case, you will see the central bank will actually prefer fast fiscal adjustments. So we're going to have detailed formal results in the case of demand and supply shock, but here we're going to do a visual summary. So we'll start with the case of the demand shock. So in this case, a slow fiscal adjustment, which is tau d equal to 0, gonna have a lower central bank loss, and a fast fiscal adjustment in which the tau d is equal to 1, gonna have a higher central bank's loss. So the intuition is the one I explained before, which is basically in this case, both output and inflation is negative. So if you delay fiscal adjustment, you can stabilize both output and inflation. And because they're negative to start with, this is desirable. So yes, you have this overshooting issue, but it doesn't seem to be large enough, at least in the standard calibration, both here and later on in the quantitative model, you will see that the slow fiscal adjustment is still desirable in the context of the demand shock.
In principle, with a demand shock, the central bank could do the job, right? But
Yeah.
it's the aversion to
Yeah.
interest rate volatility that prevents the central bank from going there.
Yes.
To what extent does it matter if you were to say there's a similar aversion to moving around the tax rate, for example? Could that then flip things if there's like a tax smoothing desire in there as well?
So later on, we're gonna actually, when we have the tax fiscal adjustment becomes distortionary. So in that case, you will have a tax smoothing motive, but we will show actually for the demand shock, you still prefer the slow fiscal adjustment for similar reasons. So you're gonna have more channels like tax smoothing, but the channel is always there. So then we're gonna turn to the case with supply shock. And in this case, the slow fiscal adjustment is basically undoes or frustrates attempts of the central bank to engineer a recession. So we'll start with the case with fast fiscal adjustments, tau d equal to 1. So in this case, this is a standard textbook case in which the central bank try to hike rates to engineer a recession. So that's why you see the output is negative, inflation is positive, standard cost push shock response. So now what if you have slow fiscal adjustments? If you have slow fiscal adjustments, they stabilize output. So output go up and inflation also go up. And even the central bank actually hikes rates more because they know hiking interest rates is not as effective as before, but they still want to hike interest rate more. But despite the fact they hike more interest rates, the output and the inflation is not as stabilized as before. So the output is still higher than before, and inflation is higher than before. And if you further delay the fiscal adjustment, the central bank basically give up. So you can see here is the case in which the fiscal adjustment speed is just 0. And in this case, the central bank just give up. They don't hike as much because they know even if they hike the rates, the fiscal authority gonna basically undo the efforts. So in this sense, the slow fiscal adjustment frustrates attempts of the central bank to engineer a recession to fight inflation. And that's why the central bank loss curve with respect to the speed of the fiscal adjustment is reversed. So in this case, which is the red line, you can see it's actually minimized with fast fiscal adjustment. So if tau d is equal to 1, the central bank's loss function becomes smaller. And if the tau d is equal to 0, actually the central bank's loss function is maximized. So the slow fiscal adjustment actually in the case of the supply shock is not desirable. So now we talk about a second case with distortionary fiscal adjustment. And here we can see even in the supply case, it can flip the sign. So if the fiscal adjustment are distortionary, then the Phillips curve gonna have an endogenous cost push wedge, which come from the distortionary tax adjustment. Of course, if you have more distortionary tax, you're gonna basically create an inflationary wedge in the Phillips curve.
So in the previous exercise, you could have done an extension where you show where once the shock hits, the fiscal authority can choose once and for all the tax adjustment. You could choose tau once and for all. And so you have a sense of what it would choose.
So the shock always hits at period 0 and
So it's a period 0 and you choose tau d forever at period 0.
So that's somewhat similar to this. So this is basically what's the tau d the central bank prefers. So it's basically I think if we do the exercise, you in your mind it's still the case that with demand shock they're gonna prefer slow adjustment and with a supply.
So we choose foreigner.
I think so.
Yeah.
Basically,
But you would have to also satisfy some budget constraint.
No, but that's like I think this also goes back a little bit to Laurent's point here. Even with tau d equal to 0, the induced equilibrium transition paths are such that you still have government intertemporal budget constraint being satisfied. So always it is within your feasible set to choose tau d equal to 0, but if you were to do your exercise, you would in the other case go to the other corner. But this is not generic that you go to corners.
But I mean, it's important. There is an element of a Santa Claus in this model, right? I mean, the fiscal effects are so powerful that it's almost like it's not quite a Laffer curve, but you could have thought about a Laffer curve for the fiscal side, right? And then you make everybody happy.
Yeah, so later on, actually, when we're going to explain this in the quantitative part, which is, if anything, this emphasizes the importance of fiscal space. So for example, if you have enough fiscal space, I think this logic holds. And if you don't have enough fiscal space, then you may get into the possibility, like, for example, the risk premium of government debt is becoming much higher when you delay the fiscal adjustment speed. So in fact, later on, you're going to see this, if anything, emphasize the importance of the fiscal space.
Even better if you freeze fiscal policy so that it could choose lump sum taxes period by period.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, even if the monetary policy is constrained, if you can choose lump sum tax period by period, you can replicate basically what the monetary policy wants to do, which is related to Chris earlier period. But
this turns, and that's okay. It turns Friedman on its head, right? Friedman said, don't do fiscal policy, and he had X reasons, which are not in this model. It's okay, they're political economy reasons, etc. This model says, yeah, do fiscal, it's great.
So I think
But they don't have P squared in the loss function. They have
Well, also they don't have the politically, which is okay. They don't have the political economy stuff, which is, you say, program. Friedman was, first of all, you do something, who the hell knows when it's going to take effect, right? But secondly, once you start a program, we're still subsidizing beekeepers after World War II. That's okay. I mean, this is like this is sort of a upper bound on what you can do.
But this is also not like fine-tuned date by date fiscal policy. This is a fiscal, like static on stabilizers in place, and then you just actually don't do stuff at kind of high frequencies. And that's just kind of what happens.
But that's
Yeah,
fine. But you're saying we don't want to think about it.
exactly, yeah.
So basically the implicit justification is we don't think fiscal rule can be chosen at the business cycle frequencies, or the monetary policy can be done. So basically that's why we fix fiscal policy as a rule and let like monetary policy can be chosen quarterly. So that, I think that's the justification about why we do this way. And so now we have distortionary fiscal adjustments. And so basically this is going to introduce a additional wedge in the Phillips curve. And then, so this opens door of the supply side channel of fiscal injection. So in particular, if you have slow fiscal adjustment, this is going to have two effects. One is going to backload the distortionary tax because you're going to, for example, if you have cost push shock, you're going to have basically distortionary, you already have a positive cost push wedge at the beginning. You may want to just backloads it, but also this is going to reduce the distortionary fiscal adjustment needed. So basically, we mentioned before, if you delay the fiscal adjustments, it's gonna stabilize output, and because of automatic stabilizer, it's gonna also stabilize the tax revenue. And if you stabilize the revenue from the automatic stabilizer, you don't need to increase the tax distortionary as much. So this is also gonna reduce the distortion tax, and this can favor the slow fiscal adjustments. So graphically, so if we delay the fiscal adjustment, partial equilibrium in terms of the dashed line, so this is gonna just backload the fiscal adjustment. But because this also gonna stabilize output, this is also gonna stabilize the revenue. So this also lower the distortionary fiscal adjustment needed. So if you look at the gray line, which is general equilibrium, the entire path of the tax adjustment also going down. So this is basically two channels. So the both channel gonna point to the direction of slow fiscal adjustment, even in the case of cost push shock, because with cost push shock, first you want to backload it. That's like a bit like the intertemporal substitution. And you also want to reduce the distortionary tax adjustment. So in this case, that's why basically with distortionary tax, and even if you have the cost push shock, it's possible that actually you also prefer the slow fiscal adjustments. So finally, let's do a quantitative evaluation. So basically, the theory is ambiguous. Does slow fiscal adjustment supports the central bank? So it could go either way, supply, demand shock, distortionary lump sum. So in this case, we built on the earlier work by Caravello, McKay, and Wolf to study policy counterfactuals. So in particular, we basically summarize the central bank's loss function as a function of the fiscal adjustment speed pinned down by two key sufficient statistics. So the first one is the causal effects of interest rates and fiscal adjustments. And so we know that empirical evidence only basically gives you this causal effects for a few elements in the impulse response matrix. So then that's why we need a richer structural model to basically extrapolate the entire impulse response matrix. So in this case, here's where we add all the bells and whistles. We have multiple household types, match the IMPC matrix, hybrid NKPC, long-term nominal debt, the bells and whistles are here. And then the second is we're gonna have the typical co-movement of historical US time series through award representation, which we estimate directly. So the intuition why these two key sufficient statistics gonna recover the object of interest is the co-movements in the US time series basically reflects both unknown shocks together with in-sample policy. And what you can use the policy causal effects to do is to first basically strip out the in-sample policy, but then add back basically what happens under counterfactual policy. So in particular, we're interested in a particular speed of fiscal adjustment, and the monetary policy is chosen optimally. So basically you strip out the in-sample policy using the causal effects, and you add back the counterfactual policy based on the same policy effects. And so this can transparently tie conclusion to the loss of the central bank to two well understood objects, which is the causal effects of interest rates and fiscal adjustments, together with basically the co-movement of historical US time series. So in this case, we do find kind of the slow fiscal adjustment is desirable. I think mostly because I think US time series data looks somewhat close to a demand shock. So for example, if we have the baseline world representation, it's largely monotone and the minimum loss for that half-life is around 8 years. If we focus on the main business cycle shock, which is a demand shock, if anything, because if it's a demand shock, it further amplifies the results. And you could have distortionary adjustments, you could have static Phillips curve, so you could change the objective. So based on objective, we have the real interest rate. You can have the change of the real interest rate, change of the nominal interest rates in no matter for the results that much. And the reason why the results is like this is because first, the fiscal adjustment delay are indeed strongly stabilizing this type of models. And second is business cycle look demand driven.
Be nice, like as an external validation or diagnostic or whatever, if you could do the empirical part on the pre-1980, you have to see if you would get the opposite.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. We can explore. So basically to conclude, so we ask question, can fiscal inaction support the monetary authority? So qualitatively seems to be yes because of the two channels. One is help stabilize output, and second is help minimize the tax distortions. And quantitatively, the answer also seemed to be yes, pinned down by two key sufficient statistics. We want to have important qualifiers. So this is kind of a design to talk about an environment with cyclical fiscal adjustments. The demand and supply shocks to the fiscal space is not issue per se, not about the long-term structural spending. And if anything, this underscores the value of fiscal space is because if the fiscal space starts to become an issue, then we're going to need to add additional channels that may compete against the channel we emphasize in the paper. Okay, thanks.
So I'm very disturbed by the implications of that. Sounds like, 1960s and 70s and 80s, Britain, pre-Thatcher, and France and Italy, lots of catastrophic policies. So trying to see where is the problem. One it could be political economy. Another would be where the tax distortions. I saw them in the Phillips curve part. Do you get also something like, steady state GDP falls if taxes are higher? Do you have that in the model or?
So no. So that's why we have this. Yeah.
It can be a very dangerous paper. It's
Yeah.
fun. It's on all four. As private researchers, we need to speculate and do right. Crazy speculation was very good. But this, I think, showing what what we all know, that the taxes are distorted for fundamental output, not just little inflation, but for fundamental output, and taking that somewhere in your vast analysis would be worthwhile.
So yeah, so that's why we put the qualifiers exactly. The steady state implication was kind of deliberately put away. But once you have for example, distortionary tax at a steady state that affects kind of the kind of this like a long-term fiscal space, then even for the case of distortionary fiscal adjustment, you're going to have competing channels, which is basically
Putting in the
yeah. Well, we will change the analytical structure quite a lot, but yeah.
Just like briefly on that, there's like a steady state baseline tax level that is distortion. That is just a conventional wedge in the labor optimality condition that does depress steady state output. And by the same token, then once you have time variation in that tax, that shows up then as the wedge in the labor supply condition, which is just the NKPC here. You just then don't see it in the first positive characterizations because those are conditioning on the sequence of real rates, and once you condition on the sequence of real rates, the NK model severs off the supply side. But
I like to see
that's in there.
The GDP, maybe things in the paper and see how GDP falls in the steady state if you have taxes.
The higher steady state tax rate, then yes.
Well, yeah, it's good. And then the calibration of that, so we can look at.
No, the basic, it's an important paper. Very challenging. And the basic question is, do we believe the multiplier is that big? That's the fundamental question. I'm not gonna presume an answer.
I would just say on the multiplier side, so the kind of first theory that Chen presented, because there you only have the only recourse back to the government budget is the output part. That's why you're limiting to the 1/tau. Once you have, say, nominal government debt, as in the later extent, inflation also eats into that. So then the steeper the Phillips curve, the multiplier will converge to zero, right? Because everything in an FTPL-like way happens via inflation instead. So the quantitative exercise at the end are in between those two, and that's why the multiplier there is around the 1.5 or whatever what Chen was mentioning. It's just the first part of the theory has this specific limit of 1/tau, which then, as Chen said, is around 3, because we wanted to isolate that channel, right? To just kind of as clearly communicate that as possible. But that's not what's going on in the quant evaluation, which is calibrated to both.
So I
Yeah.
stop just because I don't take time to authority. in the data, do we think that multiplier is 1.5? Is it not?
But that's what it is, and that's what it relies on, and like the weaker, the more you go below that, you still have the directional stuff that we talked about. So like the y-axis will be just straight, you will get less of a, but I don't think the slope you
But
affect.
uncertainty about that is precisely the risk for bonds.
Yeah, I mean, the short run multiplier, maybe 1.5, but the long run, if you go from 20, the state tax starts taxing 60% of GDP like it does in France, that must be really negative.
But I think these guys don't.
Yeah, long run
It's not
multiplier.
that this bad stuff happening, short-term tax. That's in the model.
That's in there.
Yeah, the question though is, I'm short run stuff too. We should stop it. Fun thing. Okay, why don't we go on to the next page? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I hope I don't mispronounce your name.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks a lot for putting the paper in the program. Thanks for coming. So this is joint work with Nina Bilyanovska, Jordi, who is sitting here, and Lucina Gornitska. And I will talk to you about the model of leverage bubbles. Before I start, the usual disclaimer applies. These are our own views and do not represent any of the views of our institutions. So our work is motivated by three empirical stylized facts with respect to bubbles and recessions that they have been featured in Jordan, Sularic and Taylor, Derich et al., Grigg, Tara, among other papers. And these empirical facts are the following. The first one is that asset price booms are not always accompanied by elevated credit growth, contrary to what a lot of macro models are producing. And what the examples that typically bring for this stylized fact is the dot-com bubble, where there was, elevated asset prices, but not a lot of leverage, versus the housing bubble before the global financial crisis. The second fact is that there are really small real effects when asset price booms burst if you don't have a lot of credit. And again, people are bringing the dot-com bubble as an example there. On the flip side, if you have at the same time a credit expansion and asset price booms before prices collapse, then you get deeper and longer recessions. And the Jordan et al. Paper saying that these recessions are twice as more severe as your typical recessions. So these are the empirical facts that we'll try to build a model and understand them and study the nonlinear dynamics around them. But before I go and show you how we are doing it, let me fix a little bit of terminology. So what we will call a leverage bubble will be the constellation of elevated credit and prices. And we will contradict this with the concept of an unleveraged bubble when there is only an asset price boom without elevated credit. And when we talk about a leveraged bubble, we'll talk about what Jordan, Sularic and Taylor have identified. We're not trying to make any statement about what drives credit or asset price drive the other.
When you say a leverage bubble, implicit in that is that it's not because of fundamentals.
Absolutely.
Right. So, I mean, the definition is not quite correct.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just credit and prices, it's something else. Like right now, we have that, but we don't know if we're in a bubble because it could be.
Yeah, so there will be a sentiment component. I will show you the bubble process, but importantly, the bubble will grow with the stochastic discount factor of the economy. Yeah, but you will see how it emerges. Exactly. That's why we don't want to say, we want to avoid the terminology credit fuel bubbles. We want to say leverage bubbles that you have these things together. Okay, so what do we do in this paper? We will develop a simple macro model to capture and study the real effects of leverage bubble dynamics consistent with these empirical findings that you saw in the first slide. And our model will put a lot of emphasis on non-linearities. And this is how we'll contribute to the literature that mainly has studied steady state on linearized outcomes. Doing so, we will also characterize the optimal policy to address what we found to be novel bubble externalities. So these are not your typical asset price externalities in the presence of borrowing constraints, and we will be explicit how they differ when I show you the planner's problem. How do we do it? we will take the Bianchi and Mendoza JP paper, which features occasionally binding borrowing constraints, and we'll just introduce a stochastic rational asset price bubble. What are these two characteristics of this bubble that will be important for the rest of the model? The first one is that the bubble grows endogenously and it will raise collateral value when it expands, which will relax borrowing limits. This is the good aspect of the bubble. This is where the bubble helps the economy. But the bubble may burst, and when it bursts, the collateral value collapses, borrowing constraints tighten, and this deleveraging amplifies the downturn. So this is the bad side of the bubble. What we're going to do, we'll build this model and then pay a lot of attention in the calibration such that we match the bubble facts in the Jordan, Sularic, and Taylor paper. After we're doing that, we'll solve it globally to study all the nonlinear dynamics of bubble and credit. So let me preview the results, and then I will just jump directly into the model. So we have two types of results. We have on one side the positive results and the normative results. On the positive results, we really paid attention to actually capture the stylized facts that I showed you in the first slide. So our first one regards the difference between leveraged and unleveraged downturns. So what we are finding in our simulated economy is that output declines about 1.5 times more when we have a bubble that bursts if it was preceded by elevated credit. So when we have a leveraged bubble, output declines are 1.5 times higher than unleveraged bubble bursts. This is very close to the 2 times that the Jordan, Sularic, and Taylor have found in their empirical paper. Now, what we can do more, because we have actually we have solved this globally and we have a macro model, we can actually study the nonlinear amplification. So we're doing an experiment where only the bubble collapses, or you get a recession because of a bad productivity shock, and then we do an experiment where they happen at the same time. We are finding that there is an amplification. We get severe recessions when the two happen together, 11.7% versus 4 and 6% independently. So you see there is an amplification component when you're putting these things together. The third thing that we're finding in the model, again consistent with these prolonged recessions, is that leveraged bubble recessions feature slower recoveries. And this is very intuitive, right, in this model. If you have elevated prices with a lot of debt before the burst, then this debt will actually give you a debt burden that it will drive you for many periods into binding collateral constraints and binding borrowing constraints, will suppress output for longer. So this is the intuition of the prolonged recessions. Now, on the normative side, we identified two externalities. The first one is your usual asset price externality that you find in the Bianchi-Mendoza model, which relates to the fundamental price of capital. The second one is a novel externality that we identify that relates to the growth path of the bubble. And I will spend time to show you exactly how this operates. Then we derive the optimal policy. We are deriving the optimal Pigouvian borrowing tax to implement the planner solution. And we saw in our simulations that this mitigates severe recessions. Essentially, it eliminates the incident of leveraged bubbles in our simulated economy. So the planner is very powerful doing that. The welfare gains, it's about in consumption equivalent permanent consumption 0.3%. This is very typical that you will find, in an RBC model. Why is that? Because these episodes are very low probability. These severe recessions, the bad bursting, are low probability events. Conditional welfare is very high, but unconditionally we get it very close to that. Okay. I will not spend a lot of time in the literature, but we're contributing to these 3 strands of literature. The one is the one that studies nonlinearities with occasionally binding borrowing constraints. What we're doing there, we're introducing bubble dynamics. The second one, we're contributing to the rational bubble literature, Usually they have studied long-term growth or linearized dynamics around the steady state. What we're doing there, we're introducing non-linearities, and we saw that these nonlinear dynamics matter quite a bit. And when, in terms of optimal policy, we identify this novel bubble externality, and we'll show you how to address it. Okay, so what is the economy? We have a very simple economy. We will have a small open economy with an infinitely representative agent. This is the building block of the Bianchi Mendoza. So essentially, we'll take the building blocks and introduce the bubble. How does this work? This representative agent owns a firm that produces a consumption good using labor, capital, and intermediate outputs that it's purchasing from abroad. Now, the agent can borrow externally at a fixed interest rate by pledging the fundamental capital as collateral, but also we allow to pledge the bubble as collateral. And this is the addition that we are doing in the Bianchi Mendoza model. The gold interest rate and the pledgeability of collateral are exogenous fixed and do not vary, again, for simplicity. We can relax with these assumptions. Now, capital is in aggregate fixed supply of 1, and the bubble will not yield any dividends, but it can relax borrowing constraints because it can be pledged as collateral. So let me then go directly to how we introduce the bubble in this economy. And our bubble process is as follows. The bubble will follow a two-state Markov process, which will be governed by an indicator IT. What does indicator say? It says whether the bubble will burst or will survive. So with probability pi, the bubble survives in the following period, otherwise it will burst. If a bubble bursts, then a new bubble reappears in the economy. If you will see there the process, we have denoted the value of the bubble at t as qtb, and it can be either u if it bursts, so this is the value of a new bubble, or it can be bt, which is the value of the surviving bubble. Now, let's focus a little bit on the new bubble. When the new bubbles appear in the economy, they're in aggregate fixed supply. We will make the assumption that again, for simplicity, these new bubbles are distributed equally across all agents at the beginning of the period they emerge. And then the second thing is that these new bubbles are always exogenously valued at the same price u. This is your non-fundamental component. So these bubbles appears due to sentiment, and they are valued at u. We can actually have a distribution exogenous for u. Having ut, it doesn't really matter for what we'll show you. Now let's go to the case that the bubble has survived. This bt in the first equation. If a previous period bubble survives, its price bt will grow endogenously with economic conditions in a way that it is consistent with rational expectations. So you will have an Euler equation that will govern the bubble and the growth. And I will spend a little bit more time for that, and it's important when we do the recursive characterization of equilibrium. Now, I will again talk a little bit about this later, but what I want to tell you is that the typical argument for the non-existence of bubbles in these infinite economies is that they violate the transversality condition. This does not be the case here. Why is that? Because the bubble has value, because it serves as collateral, and the critical condition here is that these borrowing constraints bind infinitely often into the future, because we have occasional constraints that will not bind in every period, but they may bind infinitely often into the future. So as long as they bind infinitely often in the future, a transversality condition cannot eliminate the existence of the bubble. And this is very related to some papers by Kocherlakota. Okay. So the representative agent problem is as follows. The representative agent will try to maximize the expected sum of discounted utility, which depends on labor and which depends on consumption. And this utility of labor, we have GHH preferences here to eliminate the wealth effect on the labor supply in the downturns. So what is the budget constraint? On the left-hand side, you have consumption CT. On the right-hand side, you have your output, which you produce using your capital, labor, and the intermediate good. Then you have to pay out the intermediate good purchases because you're buying them from abroad. This is the PVVT. Then you have to rebalance your borrowing from the previous period. So you have net borrowing. What is your new borrowing? Your new borrowing that will mature next period is LT plus 1, discounted at the fixed interest rate is R. And then you have to repay your existing borrowing, which is LT. Then you have to rebalance your net purchases, the fourth term in the equation, no capital purchases. QTK is the price of capital, and you rebalance your existing stock of capital. And then is the last term, which is what we introduce. You also rebalance your holdings of the bubble, and you will see the indicator either. So if you put the indicator either at 0, which means a new bubble has emerged, then you are getting a bubble today, which is your holding of 1, and you decide how much you hold to the next period, XT plus 1, at the price of the bubble QTB. If it is not, you can put the indicator at 1, and you will see that you just rebalance your surviving bubble. Now, the borrowing constraint is again, you can derive it from macro foundations from a limited enforcement problem, very similar to German Quadrini. We follow the structure of Bianchi and Mendoza here. On the left-hand side, you have your long-term debt, which is LT plus 1 over R, but also you need to actually borrow a part of your working capital. And this is an assumption that is made in this type of model such that the borrowing constraint matters for output. And on the right-hand side, you have the pledgeable value of your collateral. So pledgeability M is a number between 0 and 1, and then you have the value of your collateral. The value of fundamental collateral is QTK, multiplied by KT, which is your stock of capital, plus the value of the bubble that you have entering the period, which is QTB. And then again, you can see the indicator function there, depending whether you're receiving a new bubble or you are the bubble from the previous period has applied. So this is essentially our economy. This is a very simple economy, but it gets much more difficult to solve it non-linearly. And when we're trying to solve it non-linearly, we'll actually have to construct a recursive equilibrium, and so actually how the bubble matters for this recursive equilibrium. And what is the complexity here? The complexity is what is the state variable in this economy, right? So absent the bubble, the state variable will just be the productivity shock and the amount of debt that you have from the previous period that you enter. So these are the two state variables. Why? Because aggregate capital is in fixed supply. So the only two state variables is the productivity and the borrowing. But with the bubble, there are two additional state variables. The one is the exogenous process for the bubble bursting or not bursting, the indicator I, and the other one is the value of the bubble entering the economy. Either it is the surviving bubble from the previous period, what will be its value, or it is the new bubble that emerges, the U. So the bubble is a state variable here. And why is it important? Because the bubble is a forward-looking variable, it's not a backward-looking variable like the price of capital. And this introduces the problem of how actually you derive this state variable, how actually you determine what is the law of motion for this state variable. And this relates to the typical problem of introducing bubbles in these models, which it is indeterminate. So there is an indeterminacy in choosing the value of the bubble. Why is that? Here I only show you the Euler equation with respect to the bubble holdings from the previous problem in the previous slide. You can see on the left-hand side, you have the value of the bubble at Qt multiplied by the margin utility. And on the right-hand side, you have the expected value of the bubble multiplied by also the liquidity premium from relaxing the borrowing constraint. Now,
The indeterminacy is only at time 0.
So let me get you that. So this equation, because I cannot solve it backwards. I have to create a law of motion forward. So this expectation here that you're seeing is consistent with many different innovations of the bubble. So they can go, this BT plus 1, it can be BT plus 1 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3, this is the indeterminate part. And as long as these innovations have zero mean, you can have many different potential paths from the bubble in the future. So this is the problem of the indeterminacy. What this literature is doing is actually putting an exogenous distribution for these innovations. Yes, so we can do that. It could be anything. It could be anything. And these are the sentiment shocks that the literature has talked about. So it can be anything. What we're going to do here is we do the simplest problem and assume all innovations are zero. Right. I mean, we can do other distributions. This will help us actually with our quantitative results, but we do the simplest thing, do innovation zero. And these are simplifying assumptions. If you have zero innovations in the price of the bubble, this means that in every state in the future, the bubble value will be the same. And then you can plug it in our Euler equation here, take it out of the expectation operator, and you have the very nice bubble growth equation that we have below. It tells you that from today to tomorrow, actually, the bubble of growth is deterministic, so you know what it will be tomorrow, which actually helps you defining a state variable in the future, and this will be inversely related with the probability of surviving, and it will be with the stochastic discount factor of the economy. Now, as you see here, the Lagrange multiplier on the collateral constraint enters as well the growth of the bubble. This is very important. If these multipliers were always zero, then the bubble would grow I mean, loosely speaking, at the real interest rate of the economy. And this is the fundamental problem that you have when introducing bubbles in thin-lived agent economies, because then there's a society condition would eliminate them. The fact that you have these mu t's over there, this means that the bubble will grow at a lower rate than the real interest rate of the economy, and this allows the bubble to have value forward. In the paper, you will see how we can, we have shown that there is a unique value of the bubble in the future, so there is a unique state, and this pins down very nicely the recursive equilibrium. We have a very nice proof in the appendix. Now, what is important, thinking now of the bubble as a state variable, this means that the bubble growth, you cannot affect it today because it's a state, but the bubble growth will affect the whole entire future path of borrowing limits. And this will be the intuition why the bubble growth externality is different than the fundamental price externality. Then we'll get to that. Okay. So let me go now, how do we calibrate this economy? So this is this recursive equilibrium, we want to solve it globally. So the solution method we'll follow is, we'll follow the Mendoza and Villalbazo R.E.D. paper. It's a fixed point iteration algorithm, and it has two endogenous variables. It will be the value of the debt and will be the value of the bubble. We'll derive a global solution, and this way we can allow for occasional bound constraints and capture only the nonlinearities that are important here. The most important part in our positive analysis is the calibration. For the Bianchi-Mendoza block of the model, we just calibrate it as them. But we really want to pay attention on how we calibrate the bubble process. And we will do it to match the stylized facts in Jordan, Shulaik, and Taylor. Our calibration process has three steps. First, we simulate the economy, right? We solve the economy globally, we get an ergodic distribution, we simulate it. Then, given the simulation, we need to identify bubble episodes. We want to identify bubble episodes that are consistent with the ones in Jordan, Shulaik, and Taylor. Then we want to target moments that Jordan, Shulaik, and Taylor find. I will get to that. And then we will set parameters in order to recover, you know, these moments. Let me go a little bit to the identified part. So we will call these these bubbles JST bubbles, Jordan, Shulaik, Taylor bubbles. If you go on the right-hand side, this is how they identify them in their empirical analysis. Essentially, in order to identify a bubble, you need the beginning of the bubble and the end of the bubble when it pairs. So the beginning of the bubble is when the price of the asset is one standard deviation above its long-term trend. This is the criterion they are using. This is the criterion we will use as well. And this is the T0 part in the chart that we have on the right.
It just raised the obvious question, which is, you know, like prices can be high for very good reasons.
Yeah. So this is true. This is true. So you may have elevated prices because of fundamentals. You may have an elevated price.
At the moment above, just mechanically with that criteria, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But both in the data and in the model, you can have what JST call a bubble episode, not just a label, right? because of fundamental reasons or because of, well, we call it the bubble episode, because that's what they call
Right, I just, there's a terminology issue, right?
it. So you can call it asset price bonus.
Right, right, exactly.
And that's what.
Okay, so I just,
It's fine.
No, absolutely.
So for this data, is that credit bubble only, or it also includes like equity bubbles?
Yes, so they have both stock market, they have equity bubbles and house price bubbles. We will use their calibration for the house price bubble specifically for us. Yeah.
Doing this at the ergodic distribution.
Yes, we're doing this at the ergodic distribution. So essentially, we
You start from one point and the, economy is bouncing back, but eventually it stabilizes at some ergodic.
exactly. So we will get ergodic distribution, and then we will play this ergodic distribution in order to produce bubble episodes that are consistent with this thing. And then we need the burst of the bubble, right? I mean, the burst of the bubble, how they do it, what is their criteria? It is T+1 when the bubble bursts. Their criteria is that after T+1, in the following 3 years, the prices decline by 15%. So again, this is the criteria that we will use in our identifying the bubbles. So T0 to T1. So this is how we identify them. After that, they have two important moments. First, the duration of these bubble episodes are 3.2 years. This also justifies why we should have, bubbles that burst and reoccur. So the duration is 3.2 years. And then the altitude of the bubble is around 70%. What is the altitude of the bubble? It is the increase from T0 to T+1. So this is the altitude of the bubble. How are we gonna get these moments? We will play with our exogenous parameters U, which is the value of the U bubble, and the probability of survival, pi, in order to match the duration and the altitude. As you will see, when the bubble originally emerges in the economy, it is very, very small. And then it grows endogenously. We find this as an appealing feature of our model because we don't need to introduce huge bubbles initially in the economy. So small sentiment shocks can actually accumulate and create bigger bubbles. Yeah.
Marks. So you need both those conditions to find the bubble. So it needs to go above constant deviation, and then at some point it has to fall by 15%. But you're not pinning down how much it's rising, and that's the 17. That's where that's targeted. Sorry, non-targeted.
Exactly. So let me tell you, because this is quite more. First, we solve the model nonlinear and we get this ergodic distribution. This ergodic distribution will give you a distribution of bubble growth. So we're going and looking at these episodes and identifying those that are above one standard deviation and then that they collapse 15% after. Then we go and look what is the altitude and what is the average duration. And we play with these two parameters in order to match these things. So this is how we calibrate our bubble process. Okay, so after we have done all that, we have an ergodic distribution. We can do a lot of stuff. What I will show you today is some event analysis, because this is what will actually help us talk closely to what Jordan Slerk is doing. Again, the paper, you can see many different variables. I will focus just on output here. What are these two charts are showing? These two charts are showing the output dynamics around recessions. So we now go in our ergodic distribution, we're identifying recession episodes. Recession episode is when output from one period to another falls. So just if it falls, we identify this as a recession. And then we plot the mean, the change from the period before the recession, and we take the mean of this. The left chart is showing the output change for two levels of debt. If before the recession you had high debt or you had low debt. This speaks actually to the first, to the result George Slerk and Taylor, that leveraged recessions are actually more severe. What we are finding is that exactly that, the recession following leveraged bubbles are roughly 1 times deeper than otherwise. So this is the first thing. And the second thing we are finding is that these recoveries are slower when debt accumulation was high to start with. So this is a prolonged, recession. So this is the first stylized facts that we're capturing there.
How long does it take to go back to zero in the red line on the left?
It will eventually go. I don't have it here, but it will eventually converge to zero because at some point, collateral constraints will stop binding. And in this type of models, when collateral constraints stop binding, then you get the best output. So it will eventually go there and, but I don't have it on top of my mind here. On the right-hand side, what we're trying to do is this, what is the source of these recessions? And we're trying to split them between different types of shocks. And we have the three types of shocks. The first one is recessions that are an outcome only of the bubble shock, that the bubble bursts, but there is no productivity shock, so the economy is that it is, average productivity. The second one is that the bubble does not burst, but there is an adverse productivity shock. This is because this is a discretized distribution. These productivity shocks are quite severe. And then the third one is when you have together productivity and bubble shock. This is the red line, the dashed line versus the dotted line. And this is the thing that I showed you in the beginning, that output losses are amplified when you have the two shocks together. Okay. So this is for the positive analysis. Yeah.
You could also have a plot where instead of cutting scenarios by high and low debt, you could cut them by constraints are binding and constraints are not binding.
Yeah.
Are these representative of those scenarios or they look different?
So when the output falls at t equals 0, your constraint will always bind.
Yeah, but you could have started from.
If you were before. Yeah, we haven't done this. So this is a good point. We haven't done this. Thanks. What I can tell you is that you see we have taken the change from t minus 1. So if we took these events with respect to the mean of the distribution, you would see that you start with much higher debt in the high debt thing. So, but we haven't done what you're saying here. Yes.
Worse bubble. What is the fraction of levers? What is the fraction of unlevered bubbles and bursts?
Yeah, so conditionally possible. I think I don't have the statistic on the top of my mind, but I will show you some. Let me tell you that. So we have around 7% of leverage bubbles in our ergodic distribution. Yeah, unconditional. Yeah, but what I can tell you is that the bigger recessions, we have a leverage bubble component, and you can see it from here. Yeah. Okay, optimal policy. I'm not going to go through these equations, but I want just to tell you that we will solve for a time-consistent constraint planner. So we'll do without commitment. So this will be optimal policy without commitment. And what does the planner do? It maximizes, the value function, the utility of the agents. Again, we'll do it recursively. It will have the same resource constraint after, of course, substituting for market clearing. It will have the same collateral constraints. So in this sense, the planner will be constrained. And we'll have two additional constraints. The implementability constraint for the capital price. This is just the Euler equation from the laissez-faire economy. So it has to respect how the fundamental price of capital is determined in the laissez-faire economy. And then you will have the bubble growth implementability constraint. This is the bubble growth equation that I showed you before. So it will respect these two constraints. What does it do differently than the competitive economy? It will internalize the effect of consumption and borrowing decisions on the price of capital and on the growth rate of the bubble. Doing that, it will understand how this affects the current and future borrowing constraints. Why is that? You can see in the last two equations that the implementability constraints depend on consumption. You can see in the second equation, that the borrowing constraint depends on prices. It will internalize how all this interact, and we'll try to do better than the laissez-faire economy. Okay, so we're solving all this. And then we identify the externalities. As you will see in the previous here, I have not included the Euler equation for borrowing. So this is the equation that actually the planner will distort with a borrowing tax. So this is the degree of freedom that we're allowing to the planner. We're allowing them to choose borrowing that does not respect the Euler condition. And how do you implement it implement as a competitive equilibrium? With a borrowing tax. So the two externalities that will appear as wedges in this first order condition with respect to borrowing, there will be the effect on the capital price and will be the effect on the bubble growth. And this is where, we get the intuition that these are very different. The price externality, being a backward-looking variable, matters only for the current borrowing constraint, right? So it will matter contemporaneously for today and for tomorrow. The first order condition with respect to the price of capital tells you how much you can relax the borrowing constraint by tightening the implementability constraint contemporaneously. This is fine. The same holds for the bubble a bit. You will have an effect on the implementability constraint of the bubble, and you will have an effect on the borrowing constraint. What is different about the bubble? The bubble is a state variable. So being a state variable, when you're choosing today consumption, you understand you affect the growth path of the bubble, which means you understand that you are actually affecting the future state. By affecting the future state, you're affecting the whole path of the economy onwards. So what you're doing today on the bubble will matter for the whole path until the bubble bursts. And this is the big difference between the fundamental price externality and the bubble growth externality. Let me give you a little bit more intuition about that. Assume that the current borrowing constraint at period T is slack, right? So you're unconstrained. So what does the planner think? If I have higher borrowing today, this means that I will need to repay more debt tomorrow. If I repay more debt tomorrow, this means that in adverse states that my borrowing constraint binds, then I will be more constrained, which means I will have to cut down on consumption, right? Because I have to repay the debt. If I cut down on consumption in the future, what does this mean? I will suppress the price of capital, right? If I suppress the price of capital, I will tighten the constraint more. So this is the vicious circle that more borrowing today results in tighter constraints in the future, which suppress future capital prices, which further feed into the borrowing constraint. This is the typical, Lorenzoni, Bianchi-Mendoza, fire sale externality also in the finance models. What does the planner would like to do about that? It will try to take less debt today in order to avoid having buying constraints in the future. This is the macroprudential tax on borrowing. So it will have a borrowing tax day. With the bubble, it's a little bit different. Now, higher borrowing today, again, the same. The planner says that if I borrow more today, I will increase current consumption. What I will do if I increase current consumption, I will suppress the growth of the bubble. I can do nothing today about the price of the bubble. It's a sentiment, right? It's a state. But I can affect the growth of the bubble. If I affect the growth of the bubble and I reduce the growth of the bubble, this is bad for me. Because in the future, in certain states of the world where the constraint binds, I want to, and the bubble survives, I want to have higher bubble valuations in order to relax these constraints. So what I will do today is lean against the borrowing so that I allow the bubble to grow more in the future and use it in the future in order to relax constraints. And this will propagate, as you will see, there is a difference equation, so this will take into consideration the whole path.
This intuition is excellent for this model, but it also makes me think about Chen's very important paper on, how sensitive would the results be? Maybe we don't know, to a quote, more empirically plausible borrowing constraint, which are covenants, cash-based. Because that would really change, I think, maybe the inner logic. And then the question is, we know in financial industries, this is about the right constraint. But for real activity, it's not the right constraint. We don't empirically. So it's an interesting question to ask. Model-based result, fantastic. But is it robust to what we think are more plausible forms of constraints?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. As you alluded to, there is a big discussion about earnings-based constraints versus asset-based constraints. And again, the discussion is still a bit ongoing there. What we call earnings-based constraints are related to covenants with, cash flows.
Yeah.
But what you are collateralizing there, most of the cases, is the whole value of the firm. So essentially what you are writing is a blanket lien on the firm. So on the background, there is a real value that is backing this claim. So essentially the creditor, if you violate your covenant, will go and seize your whole firm. This is what we have here. So he's seizing the capital, he's seizing the bubble. Of course, there will be a different trigger how you would write this, but at the background, there is something that always the creditor will see.
It would be fun to work out.
Yeah.
just as a-
No, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so optimal borrowing tax, implementing the planner solution. So we can show that this borrowing tax will have a bubble growth externality and the fundamental price externality. And this is the policy function for the optimal tax as a function of the outstanding debt. And because we have two state variables, I just have for different levels of the bubble in the dust, in the blue, and in the large bubble case. When borrowing constraints do not bind, which is for very low also debt, you don't do anything. They don't bind today, they don't bind in the future. There is no reason why you should intervene. After a while, when you have more and more debt today, the possibility of binding borrowing constraints in the future increases. So you put a higher borrowing tax, both for the fundamental price externality and the bubble growth externality. Now, at some point, if you have more and more debt today, this means that borrowing constraints may start binding today as well. So you wouldn't want to tax borrowing a lot because you will be penalizing current consumption a lot. And as you see, the tax starts going down. What does the bubble do? It allows you to have more slack today, so you can actually have a higher tax in order to lean against bubble growth in the future. And you can see this in the red line over there. So this is the good aspect of the bubble here. Okay, I have 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Fantastic. So, yeah.
I was expecting you to subsidize early. Because you want to raise the value of the bubble. So you want to say, I'm gonna give you a subsidy and later on tax you. So that...
This is the key intuition here. You can do nothing about the value of the bubble today. So what you can only do is affect the growth of the bubble in the next period. So you can do nothing about the bubble. The way that you can actually, you want to create a bigger bubble, you want to subsidize the bubble, but in this type of models, the way that you increase the growth of the bubble is actually
by promising a decline in tax at some point.
If you promise, yeah, if they promise in the future, So yeah. So this is the tax today. Yeah. Yeah. And notice this is time consistent, right? So at every period, you take into consideration what the future plan will do. There is no commitment here. So if we had commitment, things may have been a little bit more interesting. You see, so it's without commitment. Yeah. Okay. So summary statistics, Laissez versus planner. What I want you to take from this, we have more in the paper and more, you asked me before about different stuff we have in the paper, but here I will show you some nice ones. What does the planner do? The optimal policy. It reduces the volatility of output. It reduces the volatility of consumption. This is good to stabilize. How does it do that? By reducing the rate that credit increases. So it really leans against credit in this economy. And you see from the credit growth 0.7% to just 0.1, also lower volatility. Now, typically in these models, with occasionally binding constraints, when you are actually leaning against growth, leaning against borrowing, when you have a tax on borrowing, essentially you run the risk that the borrowing constraints will start, binding more often. Now, this is what you are seeing here, the incidence of a recession, which means a slightly drop in output increases, but the size of recessions are much, much smaller in this economy. Why is that? Because under the planner's economy, borrowing constraints bind more often. But very, very importantly, this does not matter for welfare. It is, second order. What matters for welfare is the incidence of severe recessions, when you have big drops in output, or what the previous leaders said, when you have sudden stops, when you have really, really, binding constraints. And as we are seeing, the optimal policy manages to reduce the incidence of severe recessions from 4.4% to essentially 0. And this is how you're getting your welfare, gains. 0.3% of consumption equivalent. Tax on borrowing average in our economy is around 2.2%. This is the optimal tax. It's a state contingent tax. You may say, how do you implement it in practice? In the paper, you will go and see we have computed welfare gains with simple rules that depend both on the level of debt versus to its mean, so the deviation of debt, and also on the asset prices. So it has two components, like, you know, a Taylor rule for this. Yeah.
You said tax and borrowing, but if I have different assets, a priori, I would like maybe to tax the borrowing with bubbly collateral, but not tax with regular collateral. Something like that?
Yeah. So, so we don't, we take the how bubbles accumulate, or how the fundamental price of capital accumulates as given. So we respect the way that they are priced in the competitive economy. The only thing we're changing in this planner is the level of borrowing.
Right, but in terms of out of these papers, maybe proposing better policies.
Yeah.
It looks like a tax on a special type of dangerous quote borrowing would be better than a blanket tax on all borrowing.
Yeah. So because
it's probably worth
it's worth exploring, and studying how you can,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So what type of kind of settings do you want to speak to? For example, we have like the household model. I think the investment block is fairly simple, and also I think by your category, you are basically using the house price. But also, I think it's a great model to speak to maybe household borrowing on real estate. It's slightly trickier to speak on the firm side, except you've done investment block, I think. So you're holding the settings.
So the way we're thinking about it is very general. Any bubble can be attached to anything. We do the house price because, you know, most people in the literature has actually thought about these bubbles in terms of land, in terms of housing, but we're thinking of any, if you like, excess valuation that can be placed as collateral. So the critical thing for us is the collateral value. Can be extended in different dimensions, this thing. Recession following leveraged asset price booms are deeper and more persistent than unleveraged booms. Time-consistent optimal policy addresses both fundamental price and bubble growth externalities. Thank you so much.
Let me ask people to do that in time if you want to. Giving the company is input out. It's Marcin. Marcin. Good. Okay, thanks Marty and Larry for putting this paper on the program. Thank you all for staying. So this paper is joined with another Marcin and Michał, and I bet it might be like the first time in Summer Institute history that our Polish paper is presented, because we are all affiliated with either University of Warsaw or the Warsaw School of Economics. But the paper is not going to be about Poland. The paper is about how business cycles redistribute welfare across generations, and if anything, it's about the US. And since we work in either like the Central Bank of Poland or the IMF, the usual disclaimer applies. So we all know, of course, right, that households differ in many ways. So in their labor market status, like the types of assets they are holding. So it's kind of also clear that business cycles and also different types of policies will not affect all agents equally. And this, there is, of course, like already literature on that. The literature has been particularly growing with the rise of the Hank models, and we know quite a bit about that. But our read of the literature is such that I think like what is emphasized in this literature is this inequality arising from different history of idiosyncratic shocks. So rich agents holding a lot of assets are typically agents that just were lucky, right, in their past of like drawing some positive income shock. And what is a little bit neglected are life cycle aspects, which creates a different type of inequality, right? So while you can say that a different history of idiosyncratic shock, there is something unjust in that some agents are more fortunate than others. And that's why they have different amounts of assets. When you look at inequality associated with life cycle aspects, there is nothing wrong with the fact that young agents hold very little assets and older ones hold more of them, because that's just like a manifestation of consumption smoothing behavior. And I think also the literature, I guess most of the time has focused on a particular selection of shocks and policies. So I think where we try to contribute with this paper, we look at welfare redistribution across generations. So we will look specifically at this kind of age aspect differentiating the households. We try to look at the business cycle as a whole, right? So we'll not look at redistribution driven by monetary policy alone, but we'll try to kind of do this kind of have an accounting of the whole business cycle, all fluctuations. And also we'll look at how this amount of redistribution across generations depends on systematic stabilization policy. Today, that will be actually monetary policy in this context. So the way we approach that is we'll develop a new Keynesian model with life cycle features. You can think about this as Cristiano Eichenbaum Evans plus housing plus a fully fledged OLG structure. So that's the model. We'll estimate it with Bayesian methods. So I mean, that's a kind of a Smets and Voters type of estimation. And we'll try to look at a couple of questions, right? So the major one is that how big is this redistribution across generations that business cycle fluctuations create? Do favorable and unfavorable shocks tend to net out over a typical lifetime? So so that's the next one. And then whether which shocks are kind of key to account for intergenerational or across cohort redistribution of welfare and through which channels they operate. And the last one is about the stabilization policy, how it can potentially, or monetary policy in particular, how it can affect the redistribution. So that's like a preview of the findings. So what we find is that this redistributive impact of business cycles is large. What I mean by large is that in some years when large fluctuations arrive, the kind of the amount of the size of the effect on some cohorts
might be over 30% of 1 year consumption, not permanent, right? But like a consumption in a given particular year. So that's quite a lot, right? Just coming from shocks arriving in one particular year. The second thing is that this impact of cyclical fluctuations doesn't tend to net out over a typical lifetime, and that means that some cohorts, at least so far, have been luckier than others, and these effects can be actually like very big. So, for instance, the luckiest cohorts that we have in our sample experience the sequence of kind of like shocks over their lifetime that boosted their lifetime utility by an equivalent of like 100% of 1 year consumption, or if you want to like express it in permanent consumption units, that's 2%. So that's
cohort
that you will see. Like you will see. That's so, and for these kind of results, life cycle aspects are actually key, right? So they are key for shocks, for the effects of shocks not netting out. And the reason is that, even if you have like during your whole lifetime, you experience like a kind of, 50% of positive and 50% of negative shocks. I mean, like, positive shocks can improve your welfare when you're young, but they can be like welfare deteriorate like when you're old, right? So it means that, things do not have to net out. So like monetary policy shocks are a good example, right? If you live through the times of tight monetary policy when you're young, you suffer because, I mean, like this is when you have like negative nominal assets, right? But if you grow old and policy becomes actually like very accommodative, you get a hit another time, right? Even though on average monetary shocks were zero throughout your lifetime. So you will see an example of a cohort that is particularly hit by this kind of situation. Also, like the second order costs of business cycle fluctuations are also like amplified substantially by life cycle aspects. So if you compare, like the standard measure of, the cost of business cycles, so you have like under full veil of ignorance, you ask a 20-year-old person, which is when people enter our model, whether she would prefer to live in a stochastic or deterministic world and how much she would be willing to pay for that. In a model with life cycle aspects, she would be willing to pay 50% more, right, compared to like a full representative agent setup. And then another finding is that this redistribution across generations is very largely driven by returns on nominal assets. So that means a couple of things. So first, like the particular shocks that affect returns on nominal assets, and these are like monetary shocks, but also like kind of safety shocks, or like shocks that affect the preference for holding bonds by households. They are highly redistributive, and they actually matter for intergenerational redistribution much more than you would think they would matter if you look at what proportion of output fluctuations they explain. And then, the very final thing is that, and related to the fact that these returns on nominal assets are important, is actually that if you, for some reason, I'm not saying that that's what you should do, right? But if the central bank wanted to minimize the degree of redistribution across generations, then actually monetary policy should be fairly inactive, right? So that, because that's the kind of policy that stabilizes the real return on nominal assets. Okay, so let me skip the literature in the interest of time, and talk a bit about the model. So this is a life cycle model we'll have 80 cohorts of overlapping generations. So households enter the model at the age of 20, live for a maximum of 80 years. Not all of the households live so long, right? There is an age-specific mortality risk, right, which is kind of idiosyncratic. And then we have, age-specific labor productivity profiles, right? And age-specific asset structure. And we'll have 3 types of assets in the model. This will be housing, other real assets like equity, right? And we'll have also like nominal assets, like nominal debt or bonds. Otherwise, the model is like, as I said, like CE style model. So we have like nominal rigidities, like habits, sticky wages, sticky prices, monetary and fiscal policy, very, very standard. So a Taylor rule and some kind of debt stabilization rule. And we'll, have 9 stochastic shocks in the model, which I would argue they are fairly standard in the DSG literature. So this is the problem of households, and I guess like this is like the interesting stuff happens in the household sector. So let me spend a little bit of time here. So this is what households care about. This is their expected remaining lifetime utility. We have of course some discounting factor, but there is also this mortality risk. And households care about consumption, private consumption and public consumption, with some habits when it comes to private consumption, and weights on both such that the marginal utility of private and public consumption are the same in the steady state. They dislike working, and we have also like these two components, which is like, they kind of like have utility from having housing and have utility from holding bonds. And actually, like there are some shocks that will kind of, perturb these preferences, and especially this one will be an important one, which we'll refer to as a safety shock. So this is like this shifter in the weight on bonds or like nominal assets more generally in households utility. So given the structure, I mean, like the budget constraints pretty standard. Households consume, accumulate housing, accumulate physical capital and assets. They earn labor income and capital income in some firms' profits, and they get some accidental bequests coming from the fact that, as I said, like some households do not die prematurely, so to say, right? And I'm just like, by showing all these things, I'm just like, highlighting in red the shocks that we have. We'll also have like, like wage cost push shocks and, sticky wages like in Erceg, Henderson and Levy. Okay, so the production side, yeah.
The people went to labor markets during recessions have worse lifetime income forever.
Yeah, I mean some hysteresis, right? Like effect. There won't be, there won't be anything like that, right? That here, yeah. So it's which is actually like I mean like because as you will see, I mean, like, the effects that we are getting are already pretty big, right? And these kind of effects would make them, right, probably like even bigger. But no, there are no kind of scarring or like hysteresis effects. So the production side, that part is like very standard. I'm just like showing you, so just so that you see that we have, also like, total factor productivity shocks, some kind of price cost push shocks, and investment specific shocks, but otherwise this is like a standard new Keynesian setup, right? And when it comes to policy, government, the fiscal authority, accumulates debt, spends on public consumption, collects taxes, labor income taxes, and spends on transfers. This public consumption is exogenous. We have a fiscal rule that responds with a delay and possibly like a small coefficient to fiscal debt and a standard kind of Taylor. Okay, so that's the model. So we'll calibrate the model quite carefully, I would say, like when it comes to like life cycle profiles. So we'll extensively use demographic and distributional data to get the life cycle profiles for income and assets. So you will see that in a little bit more of a moment, and then we also calibrate the steady state ratio of the models to sample means, but the remaining parameters will be estimated. So in that sense, like this paper has a kind of like Smets and Voters flavor, because we'll use US aggregate data going back to 1960. We'll have like the standard macro time series, 7 of which are exactly the same that Smets and Voters used. But given that we also have housing, which is actually like potentially important to have, because that's an important component of household assets, we'll also have real house prices as observable, and we'll have a public debt to GDP also like as an observable variable. And then, the estimation is just like, like in the DSG literature, like, with the Bayesian methods. So just to show you these kind of life cycle profiles, because they are important, right? I mean, like, even though, these are like standard things. So we know like that labor income by age. So on the horizontal axis, you have like the age of like, agents. You see labor income is growing more or less until like, early 50s, then it falls down. The former part reflects increasing wages, the latter part, like, leaving the job market. And then with age, transfers, which otherwise like are not very important part of households' income, become more important because of pensions. Now, when it comes to assets, households also gradually like accumulate assets more or less until the age of retirement, and then slowly run them down. But what is also important is that, the composition of assets changes, right, over the life cycle. So you see that households accumulate housing, that's the blue part, again, like more or less until the retirement age, and they run them down, but actually like the pace at which housing is run down is actually pretty slow, right? So it's not like a steep fall. Then the real financial assets, right? I mean, like they have a much steeper profile, right? Like until like more or less retirement age. And then they are like run down also like at a faster pace. And then when it comes to nominal assets, we have, we have both assets and liabilities actually, right? So households actually like accumulate nominal debt. This is, I guess, like mostly mortgages, right? Until like maybe mid-40s, but at the same time also like they accumulate some assets like nominal assets in forms of like deposits, bonds, etc.
That's an average or a median?
That's an average, like that. Yeah. That's a cohort average. So an important point in life, so to say, from the point of view of the results of this model is like maybe like mid-40s, which is when actually like the net position in nominal asset turns from negative to positive. Right? That will be like an important moment. Up to like mid-40s, households on average hold a negative position in nominal assets. Right. Well, later on, like this flips. And then another like important aspects actually like after households more or less like after like the retirement age is actually like also like households run down these nominal assets not at a very, very fast pace. Okay. So let me move to the results. These are like quantitative results mainly, but let me establish a couple of kind of definitions or metrics that I will be using to show these results. So the key one will be like the welfare impact of shocks arriving at a particular point in time. And we'll measure it as remaining lifetime utility, expected remaining lifetime utility at this particular point in time after the shocks at time t have materialized compared to the situation before actually, like, the expectations of the remaining lifetime utility before shocks at time t materialize. So this is this kind of like unexpected revision of remaining lifetime welfare, right? And you can like measure it at each point in time. Then we also define a kind of like a bit like a funny object maybe, but I mean like for lack of a better idea, we want to kind of like have a summary measure of the total amount of redistribution, capturing some kind of like a dispersion of how like different cohorts are affected differently, right? At the same point of time. By business cycle shocks. So this is the kind of like the weighted sum of absolute deviations of welfare impact of a particular cohort compared to the kind of like whole economy average. So this amount of redistribution measure more like it has this feature that it's zero if all cohorts are affected identically, right, by shocks arriving at time t. And the higher they are, the bigger the total amount of redistribution. So yeah. Say it again. Why what?
Equivalent variation. Like as a welfare comparison all financial wealth, for example, why would we be a good metric? Why utility? Because you have a value function, right? So you could.
Yes. So it's, I mean, like, we enter, so that's a question why we enter assets in the utility function, basically, right? I mean, like, it's, we have to generate some movements in house prices, and I mean, like a typical way of doing that is just to like, include some preferences for housing, and I mean, like, so in typically like in a model with housing, you have housing in utility, right? With bonds, I mean, like just to capture this kind of, flight to safety behavior, right? These kind of things. So that's the reason. This is not something that we kind of, invented, right? Like papers, some papers have it. Okay, so and as I said, like if we want to kind of examine the effects of shocks arriving at a particular point in time, then we'll express their effects as an equivalent of 1 year consumption, right, of a given cohort. So that kind of what the numbers are. And actually, we can also like decompose all of these results by shocks and channels, and that's going to be important. And I mean, like this decomposition by channels is very useful because, like technically speaking, this is just like, obtained by totally differentiating the indirect utility function and then, using envelope theorem. But then, I mean, like if you look analytically what you get, and this is an example of the effect of house prices, it actually like is very helpful in like understanding, while in our results, even though house prices are pretty like volatile, they do not actually like matter so much, right? When it comes to agents' welfare. And the reason is that, what actually like matters for the effects of house price changes is like maturing assets and not their absolute level, and housing gets accumulated very, very slowly, right? So the increments in housing year by year, and same when you run housing down, these are actually like small increments. Okay, so I will show you a couple of like, figures that will present the main results. This is, I mean, like, we're not gonna talk about that, like all items here, but this is a kind of like a way of summary presentation of how different age cohorts, right? I mean, like, so age is on the x-axis. Here on the y-axis, we have particular years in which business cycle shocks were hitting. And then, we use this kind of heat map that, the green means that these cohorts benefited from shocks arriving in that particular year, while the red ones mean like that these are like the losers, right? So that I want to make like two general points from this picture. Is that first of all, is that these effects are sometimes actually very large. So you can see like there are some like episodes in which you see dark green or dark red, which means that just shocks arriving in a particular year have kind of like had an effect on households' remaining lifetime welfare, equivalent to something like a 30% of consumption in this particular year. So that's quite a lot. So that's one observation. And then the second thing is, which is maybe like not so obvious to see, but while there are years in which as you would say, like a tide lifts all boats, so like the kind of like the like 1970, it's all red, right? For instance, right? Then in most of the years you see actually like red and green, right? At the same time for different cohorts. So you see that in those particular years, the business like cycle fluctuations or the shocks that arrived in that particular years redistributed, right, between agents with different age. And you can kind of like see that it's, I hope you can see, right, that these episodes kind of dominate right here. So most of business cycles are redistributive across different age cohorts. So this is this kind of like summary measure of, yeah? Yes. This is, this is like COVID, like, COVID was actually like, driven like very much like by this kind of like a safety shock here. At least according to this model, you had like a huge monetary policy easing, right, during COVID. So that made like, the amount of, interest paid by households like small, right? And this is like young households are indebted. So that's like one of the manifestations why this like really like a nominal asset channel is kind of key, right? So in this year of COVID, this kind of, played a big role.
In the model, the old suffered because of what?
No, because they hold like positive nominal assets, right? So for them, like low interest rates are not so great. So that's I mean, like, there are many other things going on. So but I mean, like this nominal asset channel is kind of key, right? Here. And this you can see a little bit of that here. So this is this amount of redistribution, this kind of summary measure of redistribution. So you can see that I think like the three biggest spikes are actually happen to coincide with some recession. So this is like the 75 recession, great financial crisis, but also the COVID crisis, right? And you see that, for instance, like 75 recession, that was like a big component coming from price markups, because this was like an oil price shocks, and that's how the model identifies this like a spike in oil prices, but also like a big contribution of monetary shocks, because policy was pretty like accommodative at that point. While more recent recessions like GFC and COVID, you have this blue bar. I mean, like it's that corresponds to safety shocks. These are like the dominant kind of forces there. But I think like what I want you to see from that is that if you look at the darkest blue and this kind of like medium kind of dark blue, which is like corresponds to safety shocks, they account for a lot of redistribution. So these kind of shocks are important in driving this particular aspect of redistribution, which is redistribution by across generations. And this is a kind of like a summary picture of that. I mean, like if you decompose this like total amount of redistribution across shocks, you see that this is like legend. It's a bit unfortunate, but this is about like 30-something%. This is attributed to safety shocks. Monetary shocks, 20%. Together, they kind of account for more than a half. While if you look at the contribution of these shocks to kind of like business cycle fluctuations measured by, the contribution to output fluctuations, this is much less, right? So these shocks are kind of like highly redistributive across generations. And then if you look at the second pie chart, which shows you through which channels this redistribution occurs, you see the dominant part, like this dominant orange part, which is this nominal asset return, right? So what I told you before.
Trying to wrap my head about the heat map. The last row was 2023, I guess, and there is only essentially there's only benefits, if I agree correctly, for the older generations.
Yeah, benefits for all the generations. Yeah, I would have to take a look what exactly happened there.
That's 5.
What 5?
At 2025, is that what you're?
No, it ends like the last. No, that's 23. The sample ends in 24. Yeah.
But there's nobody losing.
Yes, this happens sometimes. I mean, like this is not a unique year in that sense. So sometimes you do have kind of, as I said, like the tide lifting old boats. It really depends what kind of shocks. So I will actually discuss that in a moment. So because actually like some of the shocks are highly redistributive, and this is like an example of a redistributive shock, a monetary policy shock, right? You see that if you have unexpected monetary policy tightening, young agents lose, right? Older agents gain. The main reason why young people lose is just through this nominal asset return channel, right? I mean, like you have a tighter monetary policy. These people typically have some nominal debt. They have to pay higher interest on debt. Not only that, there is also like this labor income channel, like, for young generations, labor income is key, right? For older ones, not. But you see that this orange part is kind of dominating. And by the way, you see that house price effect is not kind of like that important, even though, as I said, like housing is a big part of households' assets, but because they get accumulated and decumulated pretty slowly, these effects are not that huge. So that's a kind of like an example of a redistributive shock, right? But not all shocks are redistributive. So for instance, like if you want to pick the least redistributive shock, like at least of the ones that we consider, that's actually investment specific shock. I don't know if you like this shock or not. I mean, like TFP shock will look a bit like similarly. So you see that you know, I mean, like there is redistribution in relative terms, right? But basically, like everyone like benefits, right? All cohorts benefit from this particular shock, because I mean, like this is, you know, there is like this dominant part of the labor income channel, right? If you have favorable investment-specific shocks, output and labor income goes up, and it is not like fully offset by other kind of like channels for these older younger cohorts. So yeah, we call this kind of like you can think like there are redistributive and egalitarian shocks, if you like, right? So this is a kind of an example of egalitarian shocks, and if these kind of shocks dominate in particular years, you will have all green or all red, right? Yeah.
Transfer shocks also egalitarian or redistributive?
No, they are redistributive, but I mean, like here it's a bit like the tricky part is a bit like, you know, here it will matter a little bit like what you assume about who like bears the burden of fiscal adjustments, right? So here we, you know, I mean, like, you know, they will be highly redistributive, but it really like hinges on the assumption who pays this eventually. So we don't really like emphasize those shocks too much. I think like here we are maybe a bit vulnerable, I would say. Okay, so this is an illustration why these like first order effects matter over life. So because you would like to think, oh, you know, like many people live like you know really long for like 60 or more years, right, after entering the model. So you know, I mean, like over that period, you should expect to receive maybe like, you know, since shocks are kind of like white noise, you should maybe expect to be like equally hit by positive and negative shocks. But the problem is that, you know, depending on which age you are, shocks can be hit you positively or negatively. And, you know, so what we are showing here, this is this heat map again, but for monetary policy shocks alone. So this is like this shock that is highly redistributive. So you see basically, right? I mean, like there is this kind of white part over here that separates winners from losers, right? And what we depicted with this kind of, you know, black line is the kind of like a timeline of a person born in 1960. So that like in the year 1980, she was like 20 years old, right? So you see what happens is actually like, you know, and this line, if you go look into like these lines, which kind of like what color of rectangles it crosses, they are mainly red, right? So you see that, you know, they were like mainly red when young, but then like mainly red also like towards the older age. And you know, the thing is that, you know, when is that in our sample, indeed, monetary policy shocks on average are kind of zero, right? But the thing is that, you know, monetary policy was relatively restrictive on average, right? Not in every particular year. When this cohort was young, so they were kind of like you know, getting a hit from monetary policy tightening, while when these people grew older and, you know, they just paid up all their debts and, you know, had like positive amounts of nominal assets, policy was relatively loose, right? And then, you know, then they get another kind of hit. So you see that, you know, there is no netting out over a typical lifetime, and this is a kind of like a stark example. And, you know, if you were born 1960 or around, you are kind of like, you know, unlucky when it comes to monetary shocks. And this is a picture about you know, about like the total shocks, right? So this is like this. This is this kind of measure that we called Nostradamus welfare, because like the way we kind of construct it is we just like, you know, ask an agent at the age of 50, right? You know, look, I mean, like here is the kind of sequence of your consumption, housing, everything that you're gonna experience, right? And so this is like a kind of like a perfect foresight. at least until the end of our sample. After the end of our sample, right? I mean, like, it's just like, we believe what the model produces in terms of getting to the steady state. And then, I mean, like, depending on which year you were born, how much you would like to kind of like pay for living in this kind of world where these shocks materialized compared to the steady state. And you see that, Marty was asking about the lucky ones. So the lucky ones are kind of here. So these are like agents born like in 1980s, maybe, right? Or around 1980, at least so far, right? Because these people mostly still live. So who knows what happens next, right? But so far they have been lucky, and and these effects are big, right? If you look at the kind of right axis, this is like, these are the permanent consumption units. This is like 2% of permanent consumption. So that's kind of quite a lot. While people born in like, 19, maybe like late 50s or like 60s, they were kind of like, losers, so to say, like so far, right? At least.
From the shocks, it's interesting though.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at, in terms of luck,
Mhm.
60s, 50s kids got huge gains from the stock market, right? Which would have dwarfed all of this stuff. Okay, which is not to say this stuff is not important, but it's an incomplete picture of the relative luck.
Oh yes. I mean, like, this is only business cycle, so like trends are taken out, right? So of course, right? So that's correct. This is just like, these kind of unexpected components, right? Not trending.
And the one thing I'm worried about, so this says that the kids or people went on the job market in the financial crisis. How do I see that generation? Just agree with that.
Entering the job market in
They entered the job market in the financial crisis, say 2008. Where are they over here? These are people born in 1990 or something.
Yeah, something like that. Either they haven't like lived long enough for the effects to be really big, but so far, I mean, like, they are kind of
It goes
like.
back a little bit to Schwab's thing, but every model has to make choices, right? But I suspect that generation got completely decimated in terms of their job market experience, and this model it's not built for that.
Yeah.
It had like a search and a job, and you could have, instead of the unions, put in the job search, say like McLaren I did with Matthias Straban. Then you could have, at least in principle, picked up how that generation suffered from
I agree. That's a very good point. Yeah. Okay, so second order effects. So I'll be short about that. So this is like this kind of like how we measure second order effects. So again, like we ask a kind of 20-year-old under full veil of ignorance whether you want to like be parachuted to a stochastic world or not, right? And then I mean, like, it's how much of these like business cycles would cost such a person. So the number we get is like something close to 1.3% of lifetime consumptions, like permanent consumption, which is already quite a lot. But I mean, like, if you build in exactly the same model but kill life cycle features, so you go back to the model with a representative agent, infinitely lived agents, these costs are like 0.87, right? So you get like these life cycle features that we added to the model. They kind of amplify these like second order welfare costs of business cycle fluctuations by something like 50%, right? So that's I guess like quite important. And despite these things that some of you like mentioned already, right? Despite the model not having hysteresis, job displacement, scarring, all these like some kind of features that we do know that increase the cost of business cycle fluctuations. Okay, so the final thing is like about systematic monetary policy. We do something really very simple. This is by no means a normative kind of analysis, right? We just we have in our model a kind of estimated Taylor rule, right? Now we kind of like, ask a question, you want to run a kind of counterfactual simulations in which we'll just, assume different coefficients in the Taylor rule. And this is like, a poor man's grid search over Taylor rule coefficients, and just see how the total amount of redistribution is affected. So this kind of, you know, I mean, we won't look cohort by cohort this time, but we will focus on the summary measure of redistribution, right? So how redistributive the business cycles would have been under different Taylor parameterizations. And there's something that we find, I mean, like you see that the local minimum, at least if you restrict the response of the policy rate to output to zero from below, it's actually like pretty much like a passive monetary policy, not passive in the, you know, in the Lieber sense, but, you know, it's just not really like not responding to output at all, right? And responding just a little bit, maybe more than 1-to-1 to inflation, right? So you see, yeah. So you see, this is actually quite a stark, I think, like effect, because of course this goes against probably like you know, the redistribution in other dimensions than age, right? But here actually like that's the outcome, and the reason is that again, like this nominal asset return channel is key. So I'm showing you this like one of the redistributive shocks, which is the safety shock. So this is under our baseline parameterization, which is, as you see, like the Taylor rule coefficients, I would say, are pretty standard, right? And then you see that this like a nominal asset return channel kind of like does a lot of redistribution. Now, when you actually follow a passive, well, passive in the sense I described before, monetary policy, so you respond barely just to ensure determinacy, right? Like if you respond to this kind of shock, just 1-to-1 to inflation, sorry, like with a nominal interest rate, you don't respond to output at all. This kind of orange part gets compressed, right? And there is kind of like, you know, less of redistribution across generation, even though, as you can kind of see from the maybe like a labor market channel, the economy suffers, right? Because, I mean, like, you know, if the policy is not active in this context, you know, the recession will be deeper, right? So that's why I want to emphasize, we are not saying that this is a kind of good policy, but from the point of view of just redistribution across generations, a passive policy is kind of, well, better, so to say. Okay, so this is like this Nostradamus welfare again, just showing that, you know, these effects can be like changed, so to say, the history of life of people, right? Depending on whether a policy was like as in the baseline, active or hyperactive or whatever. So this can kind of like matter. Okay, so almost out of time, so let me quickly conclude. So we find like, you know, that business cycles redistribute across generations quite heavily, right? Effects do not cancel out over a typical lifetime. So like first order effects do matter. It's a kind of mistake to abstract away from them in a realistic kind of like cycle setup. Some shocks are more redistributive than others, and safety and monetary policy shocks in particular stand out as the most like redistributive ones. And through which channels it occurs, like the nominal assets return channel is key. And again, like what I said, is that, you know, if for some reasons, right, like minimizing redistribution like across generations was the goal, then actually like the less aggressive policy is the better from that particular narrow perspective. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. The next paper. Oh, send this paper.
All right, thank you very much for putting this paper on the program. I'm going to talk about the future in today's prices, evidence from a survey of US firms, with a joint work with Philippe, Alex, John, Jenny, and Egon, and Philippe and Alex are in the room. So what motivates us in this paper is a core feature of our macro models, which is that price setting is forward-looking, and usually expectations about the future enter through an aggregate Phillips curve, which is based on firm price setting. And prototypical such pricing rules relate price changes to cost changes and expected future cost changes. The crux with this is that identifying the loading on the current cost, the beta, and the loading on the expected cost, the gamma, is empirically quite challenging because of indigeneity, but also measurement issues. There might be limited markup shocks that bias the coefficients. There could be simultaneity bias because of demand shocks, which moves both prices and cost functions maybe are not linear. But the biggest challenge of them all is really in the data, which is that it's extremely rare to have both firm level prices, firm level cost changes, and firm level cost expectations at the same time. What we do in this paper is we identify these two coefficients from survey data, and in particular, we use cross-firm variation in exposure to this academic gift of the 25 trade policy shock. So this is possible because of a new survey of small and medium businesses, SMBs, in the US, who report realized and expected cost changes, as well as the trade policy components at the moment of the price change. This data then allows us to apply an RV strategy where we can exploit the variation in the firm level exposure of cost changes to trade policy and use that to instrument for the two variables we're interested in. And on the theory side, we present a generalized hazard pricing framework that allows us to map pricing frictions and to pass through across horizons, but mainly motivates our empirical specification, but then in conclusion also allows us to discipline our model choices. So just very briefly, the first finding that we have is that both realized and expected cost matter in the firm's pricing decisions. There is a coefficient of 0.7 on the realized cost changes and of 0.4 on the expected cost changes. And then second, behind this all, pass-through is very heterogeneous across firms. In particular, the expected cost pass-through is concentrated among the sticky price firms, but also among the high uncertainty firms in the service sector and in the firms that have a high labor share. And the current cost pass-through is really dominated in the complements of these characteristics. And then third, there's some policy implications. A 1% cost shock implies about a 95 basis points higher annualized impact of first quarter inflation. But under high uncertainty, this is cut to about a third. And in contrast, a 1% expected cost shock has about a 60 basis points higher annualized first quarter inflation, but in a high uncertainty environment, that sort of doubles almost. So this suggests a role for expectations and uncertainty management towards also firms, not just households, to reduce perhaps anticipated inflation. Yes?
We say expected cost change. Suppose the firm used only backward-looking expectation to form expectation in the future. That's also an expected cost change.
If it was
like, is it do you take a stand on how was rational expectation in the future, or it could be just very backward-looking expectation?
We take no stance. I'm going to show you. We're going to be very empirically motivated. But I think this is.
So if we're completely backward-looking, the way they form expectations, that we look at the past growth or something, growth of prices, that would show up in your expected CIE, and with a coefficient of 0.4. It doesn't mean that it's super forward-looking.
I actually very interested in asking firms more, how do you get to that expectation? But I think that's sort of the second layer.
Okay.
So, this, I think that's exactly the question we want to ask in the follow-up. And so for now, our takeaways are really that we find that pricing fractions may explain why expectations matter, but also there's uncertainty in other stuff, sectoral processes that define the forward-looking behavior. And just taking this against the standard set of models we have, this points towards endogenous pricing models or models with imperfect information, or some more complex models for which we need to learn more. So I'm just going to cursively touch on the literature here. There's a large literature that has related expected inflation and pricing, pass-through of cost shocks, pass-through of expected cost shocks. On the theory side, we relate to literature that uses generalized hazard models to model price setting. Our relative contribution is really to appropriately measure at the firm level the realized and expected cost changes at the timing of the price adjustment, and then use a trade policy IV to identify the true channels and complement that with some conclusions about modeling. So let me go right into the data here, describe the data, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how we estimate this in great detail, and then going to show you the results. So the data come from a novel survey of small and medium businesses, that is firms that have less than 500 employees. This has been run by this firm Morning Consult since 2022, and in recent waves in collaboration with the Boston Fed. So it's a great resource for academic and policymakers. There are about 600 firm owners and decision makers per quarterly wave. So you can think about, you ask your baker, what do you actually do? So the guy probably knows what he does. We can make this a representative sample of small and medium businesses in the US by using sampling weights that fit the Census 2023 annual business survey distribution according to region, industry group, and firm size for these specific firms. To give you a flavor of what firm we have, the medium firm, small, 2 to 5 employees, has about 100 to 500K revenues and about 7 to 9 years old. And in this paper, we specifically use a research model from Q3 25, into which we insert questions on price setting decisions and cost expectations. And I'm going to show you what we do. Particular innovation in terms of measurement that we have in the survey relates to survey questions and timing. That is, we anchor the variables we're interested in to the most recent adjustment rather than the current survey date. So that allows the timing, or this retiming allows us to take the estimating equation and map that directly into the variables we elicit from the firms. So here's a schematic diagram here, and on the right you see what typical surveys do, right? You have a survey date, and at that date you elicit the price change, the expected price change, the cost change, and whatever variables you're trying to measure. But that's not the date of the actual adjustment. So in our survey, we measure everything at the price, at this time of price adjustment. So the price change at the recent adjustment date, the cumulated cost change between the previous and the last price change, but also the expected 12 months ahead cost change
So
at that date.
asking them, what do you think costs? That's very important.
Exactly, at the time, and I'm going to show you also the exact questions, just because I want to be super transparent here. And on top of that, we can also ask them, what is what is the cost change and the expected cost change due to this trade policy event? So here, let me show you the question directly. So the first, let me show you the two main questions. So this question is about the price changes, and we simply ask them, please think of your main product and service and the most recent price change for it. By how much did the price change? So try to have simple language, and then they can fill us in by the amount of increase or decrease. And then we also elicit cost changes. There we ask respondents, now please think back to the most recent time you adjusted your price. We're interested in how your firm's costs changed between the most recent and the previous price adjustment, and how recent trade policy may have contributed to these changes. And then respondents can respond to the change in cost between the two price adjustment and fill in like before the numbers. And then we also ask them to fill in numbers that relate to the trade policy change. And we have an analogous set of questions for expected cost changes. So this is a very basic question that just elicits their beliefs. Yes?
Do you worry that this ordering might bias in the direction of accounting for the price increase via cost increases?
It absolutely it could, but they are in the data, they turn out not to be correlated, right? If they were perfectly correlated, we have a big problem, but they're not. And you'll see that. Yeah. So let me go on, but I'm going to talk also about biases later. So
Did you randomize the order that you asked the questions?
we could, in principle, it's just, we can repeat this and so on. This is exactly what you probably should do.
In general, my impression is that not probably people overestimate, and then when I say people, it's a bit generic, but if they overestimate the extent to which or maybe they over-explain the extent to which price changes are accounted for, explained for, caused by cost change.
You're
Because,
absolutely right.
saying that
Yeah.
I increase my markup doesn't sound that great. So
We have thought about it. This is a good question. I actually have a slide and a half for you. How this might be a constraint, but I actually don't think I have some figures that show that maybe not so much of a constraint. But hold the horses for a little bit, please. Yeah. Okay. So we validate also the survey in other ways, in 2 dimensions. So first one is concerning the tariff exposure of firms, and here sees two panels in this figure. The left shows you basically that about a third of our small and medium businesses in our survey are importers, so that's the share, and obviously there's a distribution. Manufacturing firms are reporting that they're importing more than arts and entertainment. I was wondering why healthcare is relatively high. Well, medication is not produced in the US, so that sort of checks out, and it's broadly consistent also with numbers in the literature. And on the right, you see the cost of firms. So we have in blue the cost changes, and in red the expected cost changes. And there is a pattern in that the service sector firms, which are on the bottom, tend to report more to be more affected indirectly and through these expectations, which also sort of passes a smell test.
Make sure I understand. So that, for example, arts, entertainment, recreation, that percent means 4% of their cost changes were due to tariffs, or they think their costs are going to go up by 4% because of tariffs?
So there's a 4% increase due to tariffs, not the fraction of the total cost, but the absolute amount.
Okay, I mean, because dramatically, what do they think is going to happen?
Our arts is
an
interesting field.
Quite striking.
Yeah. So, but it also checks out, right? The other way would really worry you in terms of surveys, right? If they reported that their inputs have gigantically increased in price. And another way to validate this, and I think this speaks more directly to the domain we're interested in, and also give me a lot of confidence in this data, is to look at hazard rates. So the probability that you adjust your price given a certain price gap. And we can do this by comparing hazard rates from a hypothetical scenario question in an earlier survey wave. So that's shown in the left panel with the gap on the x-axis and the reported probability of adjustment on the y-axis. And we can compare it with a paper by Peter Karady, myself, and Jesse Wursten, which uses actual retail data, computes the same on the axis again, price gaps, and then the probability of price adjustment. And the empirically relevant range of it, like maybe 5% of the data is between -20 and +30, +20 in terms of the price gap. And you see this is a remarkable match, even in terms of the magnitudes. If you could look at medians, this bump in the middle also disappears. So I think that gives me some confidence in this domain on the prices. Now let me carefully talk about our modeling framework, which is going to motivate our main empirical specification. And here we basically cast the firm's pricing problem using a general linear quadratic setup, whereby the optimal reset price minimizes the discounted sum of deviations of the price that we choose from this frictionless price that's prevalent at the time, and we think is equal to the marginal cost over the random lifetime of the firm. So very general setup. If you take the first order condition that tells you that the optimal reset price equals the discounted survival weighted average of these expected frictionless prices, and here the SJ denotes the survival function, that the price is going to last until period J, and summarizes the reset process. And we're standing on the shoulders of giants here. This is nothing dramatically new. And just to show you what this means graphically, if you relate the survival functions to pricing weights, right? They map into each other. And in particular, that's going to be important for what we do later with the estimation. The weight in time 0 is the weight on the contemporaneous cost, and 1 minus W0 is the weight on the future. So very, very, very simple distinction, but that's going to pop up and link the model to the data. In fact, how do we link the estimating equation with our survey questions? So let me walk you through this, and let me start with a simple accounting identity whereby the expected future marginal cost is equal to the current cost plus the cost changes that you expect to occur until that future date J. So then using the weights have to sum up to 1, we can rearrange this first order condition so that your optimal reset price equals simply the realized cost plus the expected cost changes going forward. You can also take first differences on the left and the right. So you get that the change in the price equals the realized cost change plus the revision of the expected future cost changes. So what these two equations tell you is that basically the reset price pass-through depends 1-to-1 on either realized or realized cost changes plus a more complicated function of sort of expectations. So I'm going to have to do something about that in the next slide to map that into our estimating equation that I showed you in the beginning. What am I doing with time? Okay, I'm good. I'm good. Thanks.
29.
Okay. So how does this link to estimating equation and service? We're going to make two assumptions. The first is that 12 months ahead survey expectations are a measure of this expected cost path with appropriately reweighted adjusted weights, Wj tilde, so there's a 1 minus W0 showing up. And then that means that the expected sum of these future marginal cost changes is equal to 1 minus W0, so the model-based initial weight, times our survey elicited expectations at time t. And the second assumption to map into the data is that expectations are formed at the previous price change. They are orthogonal to current realized and expected cost changes. And then taking this together yields our main estimating equation relating price changes and cost changes. This is weight 1 and expected cost changes with the weight 1 minus.
Are you talking about assumption 2? I don't entirely understand it.
Yeah, that, you know, basically that says that this term is orthogonal to the cost changes.
How would that be true?
I'm going to discuss the potential objections. That's exactly right. So back to my next couple of slides. So let me walk you through this. So there are a couple of identification challenges here. And you know, if you just took this to the data and estimated this with OLS, you probably get biased coefficients beta and gamma, partly for the two reasons I mentioned, and also what Marty just brought up, right? There could be some omitted anticipation effects, some kind of, you know, you understand at time t0, the costs are going to go up, so they're not really surprises. And then second, there could be shocks that simultaneously affect prices and costs at the same time. So you have to find an instrument for these two. The instrument we use instruments the current and expected cost changes, and this is the novelty we introduce here, with these trade policy induced components to the cost and expected cost changes. So this is Z1 and Z2. So they satisfy almost by construction, right? This is the relevance criterion, but there's also some rank condition that checks out. And under the exclusion restriction, the trade policy exposure is going to affect prices mainly through the realized and the expected costs.
What does that actually mean, trade policy and these components? How is that? What is that objectively measured? How is that measured? Just by asking them, or?
It's this
that
part.
Okay.
This part.
Okay, no, that's good.
And it's an important question, therefore, earlier, right? These things are not perfectly correlated. Then, of course, this doesn't work, right? Let me go forward. Where are we here? So, you know, then if we do a joint IV, right, we have to make sure this is orthogonalized properly. We get the identification for these two terms. And I think that addresses this omitted anticipation effects as long as these 25 tariffs were not forecastable sometime in December or November, which I think is reasonable given, you know, the timing, the craziness, the magnitude, and the incidence, right? If you could forecast to me in November, December, exactly what would be the path of cost changes, you know, then we have a problem with identification. But you can also look, you know, at the stock market reaction in April. I think that shows a little bit that this wasn't perfectly anticipated. Yeah.
I mean, we knew the direction. We had no idea how much. We knew as of the election that I think that knowledge, if I understood correctly, your assumption 2 violates assumption 2. and again, you can see, like, you know, the Cavallo prices, you see a change in the trend graph earlier than March. And in my company, we talked about it in November. We are not a small company, but we did talk about it in November. And we were right that actually, although we had no idea how big it was going to be. So the question is, again, would that simple directional thing violate assumption two?
I think you mean this assumption probably less, but you know, you can doubt this, and this is I'm fairly transparent here. My take is it's hard to forecast it, especially for the small and medium businesses that we have, and this also went back, you know, by court order. So I don't think what you rationally forecast is so clear. My course also has a
noisy signal, and the question is, right? I mean, it was a noisy stop.
Yes.
And then the question is how noisy
you're also going to see the results a little bit. So, and I think I wanted to answer that to your question earlier. There's a lot of economic theory in the background, which I'm going to get at some point, that gives us intuition. And a lot of the stuff moves in the right direction. So this is sort of a validation if we're exposed structurally from what we think should be happening. And if we get something that goes directionally the right way, I think it also validates what we measure.
In exclusion restrictions are a priori, so I don't think the data are going to tell you anything unless you have an already defined restriction, but whatever.
Yeah, I think Jenny got a comment.
All that. Variation here, so to the extent there were details about that you cannot predict sectionals.
That's where the variation comes from too, right? So I think that helps us, yeah.
Thinking about the exclusion restriction, could you give us, I'm wondering if like you're using this cross-sectional variation, to what extent it might be related to say like other demand related factors, like there's if they're like a PP business, depending on where they are in the supply chain, like they might anticipate negative demand effects, and that might be correlated with some of their inputs.
Yeah, these are good questions. So there's a little bit of this in the second point, and to some extent you have to assume that the first order effect is through your cost change. You know, you're affected by the tariffs through your cost, and that comes unexpected, especially for the small businesses. But it could be indeed that, you know, there's some firms, there's a negative markup correlation, right? And for whatever you explain that with your costs, so costs go up, you're going to eat that into your markup. But you know, we also know some firms sort of saw this an opportunity to increase their markup, so it could go either way actually. In this first case, we probably have a downwards bias still there, but it's a conservative estimate then for the effect of these expectations going, especially for these service firms, affecting your prices, right? So this is definitely there, but I think that is probably, so gives us a more conservative estimate. And as long as, you know, these cost changes, we don't care whether these are direct or indirect cost changes. This is the realized cost you face ultimately, so I think that's fine. But this came up earlier too, so I think I'm glad I put this slide in for you guys. Because of the survey nature of this data, there could also be further identification challenges, a little more behavioral, like limited memory. We don't think this is we don't find any evidence that jumps out at us that limited memory across recall times. So when you ask this question, put it on the problem, like, you know, people are very inattentive, they just browse through, or there's some systematic round numbering across recall times. In fact, if you look at distributions of prices, cost, and expected cost changes, they don't really differ in a very systematic way across the times when you asked for them. So you can see this in an example for cost changes in this figure. On the very right is just the survey date. You know, you change your price there. So what's the cost change distribution at that date? So there's no recall problem, no ration, not so much going on there. But it could be that in the past somehow you rationalize this a little bit more because it's harder to recall. It's a little bit to your point, or it could be very far in the past that you do this even more. But I don't, you know, this doesn't look strikingly different to first order. And I think, let me also step back and give a similar answer to what I said before. none of this limited memory would explain in a systematic way economically meaningful variations of our reset pricing with duration, uncertainty, sectoral incidence, or labor share. That is a priori very clear to me. But so I think you have to have a very complex story, which you can and which might be interesting, but we don't have that at this point. In particular, you could have a manifestation of this limited memory in terms of hindsight bias. It's a little bit actually like your point. So I'm not going to talk much about this here. But just the story is basically firms rationalize the price outcome by reconstructing ex post what they must have expected in terms of the cost change. So it's very similar to your point. And then gamma would be upwards biased. You put more weight on that is now very correlated to price changes. However, if you sort of look at this and think about this a bit more, then it's not clear what the bias actually is. It could be positive, could be zero, or it could be negative. And I'm happy to talk about this more, but when we get to the results. So what do we actually find here? And I think I'm good with time, yes. So how do firms adjust prices to current and expected cost changes? So this is our main table here. And you should look at the second column, which is the set of IV results. And you see that both matter, the realized and the expected cost changes that we measure. So we have a pass-through of about 0.7 on the realized cost change, about a bit more than 0.4 on the expected term that we measure here. But under the hood, there's a lot of heterogeneity. Yes, maybe that's your question.
Because otherwise, the way you measure cost is affected by how much firm produces, which is itself affected by the price it sets, and the pass-through would also be affected. Your formula would be affected by depending on returns. Is it true that you need that assumption, or?
So from empirical specification, I don't think we need that.
Well,
if you have sort of
depend on scale, you could have non-constant returns, right? So when you're asking firms about their costs, what they're saying is endogenous to price change.
So I'm going to have some industry cuts, maybe that alleviate some of your concerns. You want to think about this more carefully and have some ideas about model extension. So this could go into this. Yes.
The model was what had highlighted was indicating the first line was supposed to be one expectation, right? The one on cost change. Would it be like the difference between a reset price condition adjusting versus realized price? Would be a wedge there is so like one minus the number that one maybe terms do not adjust. So that would be a way of explaining 0.6 instead of 1.
So this is also a good point. There is obviously a lot of standard errors really close to one, and I think there are multiple explanations we can think about this, right? There could be some downwards bias because of some way there's sort of trends that you might anticipate, but I said this would be then conservative, so this could be a little bit too low for that reason statistically. There could be economic stories, there could be complementarities we're omitting, right? They would go in the same way. So I think that's something we want to investigate more to understand. But this is sort of what we can do with the setup. We can go a little bit further here because this is a very rich firm survey. We can look at sample splits according to pricing frictions, the sectoral incidence, the labor share. So this goes a little bit more the question. And something that turned out to be very interesting is uncertainty here. And then we can also do a cross-validation following a paper of Ivan's. Okay, so let me start with the heterogeneity dimension. So we can split the sample into firms of different average price durations. We can do that because we ask firms on average, how often does the price for your product or service change? And this is what we get. And we can cut it at the median, it's like 6 months, into sticky and very flexible firms. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to show you the results for that first. So these are the flex price firms defined by an average duration of less than 6 months. So that works out to be about 3.5 months on average. And again, look at the second column. Here you see basically full pass-through, as you would expect for these flex price firms. But there's no significant role for these expected cost changes. Also, if you adjust every period, that's probably what you would find in most models. If you look at the sticky price firms, so firms that have an average price duration of more than 6 months, it's flips. There you get a weight both on the current and the expected future cost changes. Comes out of most of the models as well. So there's a role for pricing frictions, shifting the kernel to the weights to the future. You might also think, if you think about the history of inflation and the recent surge, right, there was something about service versus goods producing firms. It's interesting to understand if they differ in a systematic way. So here we look at goods producers, and then I'm going to show you the service sector firms, and you can look at the second column IV estimate. You see that for these goods producers, there's, given a standard error, there's nearly full pass-through of these past realized cost changes, but very little anticipatory pass-through of these expected future cost changes.
And I assume goods producers are much more frequent price changers.
Very good question. So I have an extra slide or something on the one of these slides here. In the next slide, yeah. So this exactly. Let me talk you through this. And now we look at the complement the service firms, and there it's an equal loading on the current realized and the expected cost changes. That's a 0.45 and a 0.4. And you might actually think, yes, these are the sticky versus the flexible firms, maybe just picking up the same thing here. But it's not a stickiness artifact itself. So you can look within the sticky price firms, and again, it's the service firms that are more forward-looking and not the goods-producing firms. So there's something specifically about being in the service sector, and I'm going to show you other cuts. One that tries to get at this a little bit. Maybe it's something about the marginal cost process in terms of labor, but there could be lots of other stuff. And at some point, fortunately, our survey is, it's a proof of concept that this works, and we would like to do more. So I'm going to go on with it, but that's the question here.
Yes. Going back to the weighting, I'm a little bit confused because you showed like two weighting schemes. One was normalized, the other one wasn't. The expectation is that the coefficient on the contemporaneous cost change from the model that you showed should be one regardless of the frequency price adjustment, right? And then so the frequency price adjustment only matters for the weight you give to the future. That's right. But that's obviously clearly not what we're finding.
So this is very informative for our
here, right, okay. So I might have missed how do you think about that deviation from that benchmark of one in your model? Because I feel like you're explaining it through these cuts of goods and services and flexible and not flexible, but the model said that you shouldn't find it there, so it must be something else. Or maybe not, and there's something missing.
Yeah, so I meant that's a very good question, and I think this is an aggregate picture, and one assumption I split into the model where quality is sitting, we have constant markups and margin costs. Basically, we expected flex price value to the margin cost, but there could be a story about complementarities or something that affects this. I want this sort of to be some stimulus to write more interesting models, and there could be information stories that differ across different sectors. I'm going to show you more, so you're exactly right. So one that we try to explore, Marty's question a little bit, maybe there's something about the labor cost share in the service sector. It's different. So we can know that from our survey data, right, that labor costs are higher share in services, not surprising, than in goods producing firms. So we can do a similar cut into low and high labor cost share firms. That's the first two columns in this table. And you see a similar pattern again. There's a lot of this basically full pass-through of realized cost changes in these low labor cost firms, and somewhat of a similar picture for these high labor cost share firms. And, this is about what we saw earlier, right? But you could also look at, this is something in the service sector. And so we can...
It's pretty consistent. That's quite striking.
Yeah, it is striking. And then on top of that, within services, so it's columns 3 and 4, the low labor cost service firms are also the ones that show a high, basically full pass-through of these current cost changes, don't care so much about the expectation. So there's something more than just being a service firm. I would like to do more cuts, but then it gets a little bit.
I wonder if this goes back to your identifying assumption. I mean, I would have thought if the labor cost share, I kind of think those are plummeted or very persistent, as opposed to a commodity price, which goes up, then it goes down. And that could have a big impact on whether I'm going to pass it through or not right away. But then that calls into question the orthogonality of the current cost and the expected cost. So I don't know, but that's gotta be different. The persistence of a labor cost change is very different than the persistence of a non-labor cost change.
Yeah, so the question is, what does the trade shock do to this, right? So something at that time, relative to the previous time when it wasn't so clear for many of these small firms what was going to happen, if that has a systematic correlation with these costs that they report. So hopefully we get more academic shocks here that we can look at. I only said academic, as I put it on.
Traumatized, well, yes.
Trying to make the best of it here. So, but talking about uncertainty, right? This is something we put in there. We can measure it, and this is actually why these firm surveys are useful. You can get something that's really hard to observe. There are other ways, but this is one. In particular, we can elicit average, lowest, and highest possible expected cost change in a very similar manner to what I showed before, and then exploit a triangular distribution to compute the uncertainty in these expected cost changes due to the trade policy. And once we cleanse out the size of the cost shock, which tends to be correlated to the uncertainty, we can use this uncertainty measure and have a set of high and low uncertainty firms and sort of repeat the spiel that we did before. What do the less uncertain firms do? If you look at the second column here, the less uncertain firms basically focus on the present and not so much on the future, according to what we measure here. It's basically full pass-through on realized cost changes. But the more uncertain firms, just according to this simple empirical measure, put substantially more weight on the future. Anyway, it's a small sample, so maybe there's something on the current or not current periods, and this might, you can think about what models you would like to use, but this point's definitely beyond a simple linear quadratic setting and Calvo and Taylor models. I hope I have time for this. So we also try to validate our expectations result. Yes? Yeah, please.
What about doing a asymmetric pass-through experiment? So can you condition them being a positive cost shock or negative cost shock and how the price responds? Because this has been, and the theory, the generous hazard function, they are asymmetric, which theories work as kind of show them a little bit, right?
Yeah,
but also BR and Talado a little bit. So it could be interesting. Right?
We have this on the agenda. It's just something you can explicitly ask me to do interesting RCTs on that with firms.
But do you have the sign of your cost?
We can do a little bit here. So I have to get back to you on that. Yeah, I agree. It's very interesting. I actually want to think about this more in a more systematic way. Okay, so then let me move on here. So you can think about a validation of our pass-through results using a theory outside our setup. So C1 has this beautiful setup where we construct a sufficient statistic for pass-through of anticipated shocks into inflation, which is basically distributionally taking the average ongoing price spread duration and dividing it by the average price spread duration in a population. So if that turns out to be 1, and like this assumption from my theory, then you get a Calvo price setting or something like Taylor, or depending on the cost and the statistics, something that's more in a menu cost world. And we use our data to create 2 subgroups with a low and high phi, where we split the sample according to a simple proxy. So this follows his idea where we have a low phi group and a high phi group, and the distinction is, or the intuition is basically that, we're going to have price spells that disproportionately draw on flat survival functions. The more pulled out this survival is, and you're going to get a particular probability of some very long spells in a Calvo-like setting, and then that flat survival is going to mean that there's more weight on the future, and that means higher pass-through of these expectations rather than there's no weight on them. That's the intuition. And this is what we get when we compute this at the firm level, where we can ask firms, we know when they last changed their price and what's the average duration. So there is the distribution that has a lot of firms in a more of a Calvo world, but not all firms are the same. There are some firms that are more towards the Taylor world, 0.5, and some in the menu cost world, and some firms have something bigger. The key question then is, the expectations pass through in line with our results higher for the firms that have a higher phi, the firms that have a lower phi. So we can split that at 0.75. So this is the low 5 firms. And you see that the firms that are supposed to have a lower pass-through of these anticipated cost shocks into inflation, reset prices, indeed, they put a lot of weight on these cost changes, but not so much into the future. What happens with the high 5 firms? Well, in line with this sufficient statistic result, they put a lot of weight now, about the equal weight into the current cost on the expected cost changes. So this the directional movement, according to the sufficient statistic, gives us a similar result as what we find. So it comes outside of our model, and it's a distributional logic. So in some way that validates our result from a different angle. Right, so I have 3 slides. I finished for you just in time. Let me talk just very loosely here about model and policy implications. And I think this is food for thought. So first we find that this higher expectations pass-through shows up for higher average price durations, or this higher phi, and that basically says, yes, pricing frictions are a way to rationalize the role of expected cost changes, like in most of our standard price setting models do. And then second, we just saw higher expectations pass-through for higher uncertainty. So that points us towards models where there's more of a state-dependent element, like option value weighting, or some model with imperfect information. Again, this low-grade people here, they can write other models. You might also think about further model extensions, and some of this came up earlier, and others have worked on this, right? There's a role clearly for complementarities in price setting, right? There's this discussion why gamma is less than 1. This is something that would imply a gamma that's less than 1 on economic grounds. You might want to think about modeling services as distinct from goods along these dimensions that I showed. And we want to be very careful from thinking about how the marginal cost process evolves there. And my last 2 slides are about the policy implications for quantitative and qualitative thoughts. So on the quantitative side, an obvious question is, so what is now the net effect of cost shocks and expected cost shocks on inflation? So we do a very simple back of the envelope calculation for a 1% increase in expected, or rather just marginal costs. And we also assume there's some gradual price adjustment out of Cavo with a 0.65 parameter. And we find there's a sizable impact. So if you look at the annualized inflationary impact of current and expected cost changes, this gives you about 70 basis points effect on inflation. And you see a lot of heterogeneity according to these different results that I showed you. Along goods and services dimension in particular, the uncertainty result is quite striking, right? That depending on what uncertainty regime you're in, you shift a lot from getting impact of current cost shocks to expected future cost shocks, and hopefully not too many coming, but this is one way to learn about this. On the qualitative side, I think a very exciting result is that indeed the policy shocks affect the prices, first of all, before they fully materialize, but uncertainty seems to be a part of the transmission mechanism. So there's something there, and we want to learn more about what this means and where this is coming from. Top of that, there's a set of lessons here. The first, the inflation effects of these cost shocks are state dependent along various ways. And second, particularly for central banks, the real-time inflation assessment can probably benefit from monitoring what firms think about costs, also how uncertain they are, and what sort of state in the world we're in. And then finally, expectation management matters for firms, not only households. There's already a very extensive literature on this. We might think, should we create very predictable, credible policy paths to reduce these anticipated price increases, and anchoring not only the level of future cost changes, but also the surrounding uncertainties, better policy call in general. I think I'm out of time. I don't have to summarize this, but thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.